Hello and welcome to our final video in our series all about how to create your very own custom garden design using the Waterwise Garden Planner website. Here's where we really bring it all together. And you may have noticed that this is a long video, so please use this video however it is going to be useful for you. If you feel like you kind of know what you're doing already, you might not need to sit through this whole thing. Maybe you can click around, get the basics of the ideas being presented, and go on and create your own landscape. But we created this video because we have had a lot of people request to really have a resource where they can follow along every single step of the way, seeing how it comes together, and then move on more confidently to be able to create their own design. So use it however it's going to be a resource for you. This is also a time to kind of pull it all together. So there's a lot of great other resources out there in the world, whether it's from the California Native Plant Society, whether it's from other local nurseries where you buy plants, or other great organizations like the Theodore Payne Foundation. And so this is not about only having to use the Waterwise Garden Planner. That's the resource we created, and so we kind of focus a lot on those resources. But definitely, if you are ambitious or really into plants, you could pull in all of the great information that you've collected along the way from all of your other sources and integrate that all into the process of creating your own design that's going to be great for you. Or if you want to keep it simple, really focus on using one or more of the planting design templates on the Waterwise Garden Planner, that's a great way to go as well, or anything in between. One quick note before we proceed: much of the rest of this video was recorded before our website was renamed the Waterwise Garden Planner from its previous name, the Inland Valley Garden Planner. So if you hear me referring to the Inland Valley Garden Planner, it's the exact same website, just now with a newer name. And so with that, let's get going.
My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm from the Waterwise Community Center, and I'm excited to finally be here at this part with you, where we are really going to get into creating your planting and landscape design. And so with that, to get started, first we need to talk a little bit about tools of the trade, starting with some very simple things. You're going to want some good pencils. So if all the pencils you have at home are really old ones and the erasers have gotten kind of very tough and brittle and don't work well, do yourself a favor, go out and get a box of decent pencils. Make sure you have a good pencil sharpener, and everything's going to be a lot easier. I'm actually partial to this pencil brand, Dixon Ticonderoga. They cost just slightly more than normal pencils, but they work very well and have a great eraser, which is very useful if you are trying to erase your design and not making a mess. Another thing that you're going to want is a good surface to work on. Oftentimes, if you don't have a desk at home, kitchen table, dining room table, something like that, but something with a good solid surface is really useful for drawing on. If you don't have that, that's just fine. The back of the pad of paper that you bought to do your landscape plans on is usually going to be a thick cardboard, and you can just kind of lay that down on top of whatever, but give yourself a good surface. You're also going to want to keep everything steady as you work with layers of tracing paper over your site assessment with some masking tape. Now, if you want to get fancy, you can go with stuff from the art store, or you can order online with actual drafting tape on it, which is a little bit less sticky than masking tape. It's really easy to pull on and off. You can get these neat little dots, so instead of ripping pieces, they just come off really easily. But if you don't have that around, or also are trying to do this on the cheap, no problem at all. Blue painter's tape is just a little stickier, works pretty well. We'll just use that in this example today. So you might have that in the garage. If not, it's just a quick trip to the hardware store, nothing super special. And what you want to do is you want to tape whatever's going to be your base layer down pretty nicely to keep everything steady as you start working with layers of tracing paper. So here we go. That's great. And you're going to want your tracing paper. So you're going to match your tracing paper to the size of the paper you're working with. We're on 11 by 17, so get yourself a pad of 11 by 17 tracing paper. The local office supply store may or may not have, if you're working on 11 by 17 tracing paper, make sure you call or check their website in advance. This I ordered online, very easy to find online. And this is what each sheet looks like. And so what we are going to do is we are going to match the edges here, and then we are going to tape this down. Now you might be, or you will be, eventually removing layers, putting down new layers, so just a couple of dots of the tape is enough, maybe 3 across the top, but you don't want to tape across the whole thing. That'll make it a pain later on. Make sure things are nice and flat. And then something else you're going to want to do, because you might remove this, put it back on later on, something might get shifted, and so even though you're doing your best to match up the sides, really the thing to do is you can just kind of eyeball the sides, and then you want to record some registration. Excuse me, mister. And so rather than relying on just the edges to line up, it's going to be a lot easier if you mark down just a couple of what can be called registration marks. So just a couple of angles where the corners should line up. And that way, if this shifts, you'll see it, and if you are putting the piece of tracing paper back on above your base, you will be able to make sure everything is lined up properly. And so in addition to that, there is one tool that I highly recommend you consider getting. It will definitely make your life easier, and that is a circle template. These are available from most art supply stores. I bought this one online, and you're going to want to get one because we are working in inches for our scale. Remember, our scale here is 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot, so we want to make sure that our circle template is going to be in inches. And you want to have a variety of sizes down to, you want to make sure that your smallest one that you're probably going to use is 1/4 of an inch up to something that could be close to the size of a small tree. So with 1/4 of an inch equaling 1 foot, our largest circle at 3 inches is going to be a shrub or a very small tree with a 12-foot diameter. And so that's pretty workable. And then if we need to have some trees that are larger, we can set those up individually, but it's not practical to have a circle template that goes all the way up to, the size of an oak tree or something like this. So we are going to open this one up, and we will do just a little bit of work to set up our most common sizes for our actual design. So what I like to do to make things a little bit simpler later on is to put some marks with a fine pointed permanent marker. So this is a brand new Sharpie, so the point is pretty fine. You're going to want to be able to make some notes on here, and so if you go with one with a finer point, that's just fine too. But what I like to do, since we're working at that 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot scale, I want to make a little dot or a little star next to the circles that I'm most likely going to be using, and then just note ahead of time what their real world size would be at my scale. So 3 inches, that would be a 12 feet. And this is one that I'll be using for sure. So 2 inches, that'll be 8 feet. 2.5 inches is going to be 10 feet. So our 1 inch is going to be 4 feet. Our 1 1/2 inch is going to be 5 feet. Wait, no, sorry, 6 feet. our 1¼ inch is going to be 5 feet. So basically we're just taking the inches and multiplying it by 4 for our scale. So if you are working at 1/8 scale, if you have a larger property where 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot, like we talked about earlier, then you would just be taking the inches and multiplying it by 8 to get your larger number for your design. And then we will go all the way down to, so with these small ones, marking out the one you're going to be using gets to be more useful, because like 17/64 of an inch, that's not a measurement that I'm going to be using for my circle template, but the 1/4 of an inch I definitely will. And so for that, I'll make my dot here, and that's going to be 1 foot. And then my 1/2 inch is going to be 2 feet. Make my dot. My 3/4 of an inch, we'll find that here, is going to be 3 feet. And then 18 inches is also sometimes something that we use. And so that is going to be our 3/8 of an inch circle. So 1.5 feet. And so that is going to be most of the common sizes we'll be using. Some plants will be 1 foot, 1.5 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet. And that should get us going. So we're well set up to then be able to use this. And instead of needing to try to count squares and diagonals each time, this is synced up to our scale, and we can quickly draw circles of the right size for our plants. For some larger plants or some other things, if people are thinking about it, sometimes people will make this circle on a piece of scratch paper and cut out little pieces that they can move around. If that's going to work well for you, you can definitely do that, but we're going to stick with this and layers of tracing paper for now. We're going to put this template aside for now and take a step back and think about what we need to first achieve when we are starting to consider our design plan. Because choosing the individual species of plants and what exactly goes where is going to come a little bit later. First, we want to start by reflecting back on our goals and our site assessment and thinking about the general structure of the landscape that we want to have. And I will take this chance just to make a note here. There is no one way to do landscape or garden design. There are many great ways to go about this. So this is just one suggested method that I have for people who are DIYers who are going to be trying this out for the first time. It's very similar to the method that I use, having done this a lot, but if someone else does it differently and that works for them, or you want to try something else and that works for you, that's just fine as well. But what I recommend starting with is going back to your goals and thinking a little bit about which of these goals are going to rely on the individual plant species selection, which we will get to later on, and which of them are just more going to inform your structural considerations, maybe where you want a tree, where you want a hedge, where you want some medium-sized shrubs, where you're going to have some areas for smaller plants along a pathway, that sort of stuff. And then you'll get to choosing the individual plants for those areas later. And so let's reflect on the goals here. Beauty, that could kind of be considered anywhere. Habitat, that's going to be partially plants and partially structure. We'll choose our actual habitat plants later on, but we know that if we want to support habitat, from what we talked about earlier on, is that we are going to want different structure in the landscape. So we are going to want either a big tree or probably a couple of small trees. We are going to want some dense shrubbery somewhere for that cover and nesting sites, and we're going to want some more open areas as well. Now, it's also going to be affected by the plants that we are going to choose later on, but we are going to be thinking, even when we're thinking structurally, that we want to support habitat with varied plant sizes and varied plant densities. Low water will mostly be determined by the plantings later on, but privacy and shelter for us humans who live here, getting some privacy into the house, that's largely going to be structural. We will choose great plants for that later on that are beautiful, that affect habitat, but we want to make sure that we get plants of the right size in the right space. That's going to be a priority. California native plants, that'll be the plant selection. Blooming throughout the year, that'll be the plant selection. Same thing as smell. But keeping our view of the mountains to the north, at least from some of the main viewpoints out of the windows, that's going to be structural as well. That's going to affect where we put trees and the size of the trees that are going to work well in this design. And so when it comes to the structural elements, we're going to be thinking a lot about habitat for this example. We're going to be thinking about privacy and shelter, making things feel less open when we're inside of the house than they currently feel with a flat landscape, and we are going to be thinking about keeping our mountain view. Now beyond that, we'll also be thinking about other garden elements, pathways, access. For habitat, we know that we want a bird bath, so we'll maybe think about a nice place for putting that. That'll kind of frame views that can be seen from the windows, all that sort of stuff as well. And so with that then, we can turn back to our plan and look at the analysis. We have the area that feels too open. We also know that we are going to need to deal with some flooding issues. So again, even before we do our planting design, we know that we are going to need some sort of capture feature, a dry stream bed, a French drain, something to take some of this water that's flooding in this area, infiltrate some of it away from the house, and in this case, because there's a lot of it, move it around the side of the house. And so those are the things we are going to be thinking about early on in the process. So at this point, the most important thing is to take the leap, don't be intimidated, and just start drawing. If you need to, and I do recommend this, right before you get into it, take a look back at your inspiration, whether it is some of the plans from the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Maybe there's one or two that you're gravitating more towards, and you can take a look at not even the species yet, but just kind of the sizes, shapes, layouts of the combinations of the trees and shrubs and small plants, where trees are in the landscape with the shrubs and the small plants, or pictures of other landscapes that you've seen that you like. And don't worry about getting it right the first time. The first time will not be your final design. Just start drawing. And that's the cool thing about working with tracing paper, is that you're not going to be ruining your base plan. You might go through 5, 10, 20 different iterations of your drawing. But if you're intimidated and you don't get started, then you'll never get going. So just get into it. One note, as you are looking at the different example plans on the Inland Valley Garden Planner and maybe pulling from them for some of your inspiration, remember to compare the scale, especially if you print them out. So if you print out the plans from the Inland Valley Garden Planner at full size, they are formatted to print at an 11 by 17 sheet. But because we're working with all different sizes of landscapes, they print out, if they scale properly, and they should, to be roughly at 1/8 scale, or 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot. So if you're working like I am at 1/4 scale, remember the size of things would relatively double. That might not be relevant to the process that some of you are doing, but if you are looking at them and kind of directly trying to emulate some stuff, remember you might be going between different sizes if you're actually trying to measure on the plan. So here's how I would start. We know that we are going to want some privacy. We know we want to maintain our mountain view. And if I go outside and actually look, what I know is that this is going to be a good area to have a small tree to obtain some of that privacy, because across the street there's actually a pretty large tree. And so this is one area where I can have a tree, and it's not really going to block that much of my mountain view. It's kind of already blocked just a little bit there. It's more open over here. It's more open over here. And this is also a really kind of great spot to have a small tree to get some privacy, because it will help provide privacy from the view from this window as well as the view out of this window as well. And so for now, I'm just going to make a rough circle, and 12-foot diameter is kind of small for a medium-sized tree, but I am going to just get an idea down. So do that, and if that was a 12-foot diameter, if I'm thinking about maybe a 15-foot diameter tree, that'll be a little bit bigger, and you can just freehand draw that for now. Maybe this eventually will be where I have a tree. Here's the center of the tree. It's going to go out into the driveway a little bit maybe, but by the time it gets out there, it'll be taller than the vehicles and it'll provide a little bit of shade. Maybe the tree won't be that big. Maybe we'll choose something smaller. But long term, we want something here. And then the other place that we know we want privacy, and it's going to be kind of hard to fit it with how the driveway is here, is right inside this room. This is where our couch is and our coffee table, and we actually eat dinner at our coffee table sitting on pillows on the floor. That's just how we do things in my house. We don't have a formal dining room or room for that in our house. So that's kind of how we do our thing. And we look right out this window, which looks to a pretty open spot. It's our driveway. We see across to our neighbor's driveway and then other driveways around the cul-de-sac. And so we also know that we really want to provide some privacy here. And again, we don't want to block the driveway, but we can have branches over the driveway. So maybe it'll be a couple of trees. And so maybe the other tree, the center will be here-ish. And I know this is going to change, but if that was going to be 12 feet, then maybe a couple of feet, because each one of these squares is a foot. And I'll have a couple of feet farther in each direction. And then I can kind of do that a little bit farther. And then, and also, even though our template's using circles, these don't need to be perfect circles because plants don't grow in perfect circles. So you can kind of just make your lines a little bit wobbly on purpose, and for trees, you can kind of go back over them. If they look weird, and do that. Kind of get a little bit natural looking canopy. And again, eventually we'll do a little bit cleaner of a final drawing, and we're going to do multiple iterations of this drawing. So this is just to feel things out. So you see how awkward and kind of off-center this ended up being. That's just fine. I actually ended up connecting to the wrong line, I'm realizing. So that's where your eraser comes in. So be loose, be relaxed, don't worry about it. How neatly you draw during this phase has absolutely no relationship to how nice your final garden looks. Just don't be intimidated. It's going to look awkward, and then you'll refine it from there. So that's going to be kind of our main way of getting some privacy. Now, on this side, some of our best mountain views are actually from this window looking out. And then the size of this tree, since we're thinking about a small tree, we also know that if this is like a 12, 15 foot tree, because I've kind of gone and tried to picture it, in this direction we'll be able to see kind of over the top of it out to our best mountain view. But for here, we know we want to preserve some of the mountain view. And then also our neighbor here has a gravel strip and their driveway. And while I am perfectly happy for the trees to overhang my driveway a little bit, I don't want them to overhang my neighbor's driveway. Depending on your neighbor, that might be something that they like, shade their car, or whatever. Definitely talk with them ahead of time, and if you do that, remember that if they sell their house, the new neighbor might not feel the same way. But my neighbor tends to like to keep things a little bit more clean, so I'm not going to have anything overhanging their driveway in that direction. And additionally, we really want to make sure that we leave this view open. And then the final thing is, from this view, the way the angle's set up, it's even kind of hard to picture the view from. This is actually a desk that we have that looks out the window. it really, even though the angles don't set it up that way, feels when you're sitting here looking out the window, your eye just gets drawn to the cars in the driveway and that gravel strip. And so what we want to do is we want to find a clean way of blocking that view. And there's a couple ways that we can go, and I think we can sketch on that. We can have, if we want this to end up being a series of trees, we can have maybe another small tree here, but I'm worried that the sight lines wouldn't work out to maintain the mountain view. So I'm not going to go with that. If I was thinking about this landscape and the mountain view wasn't an issue, I might just do this as one of the landscape template types that I like is the oak woodland. Maybe I just anchor a huge oak tree eventually over time in this landscape, or something that'll shade the driveway. But this view is really important. So what are we going to do that's going to meet our goals, that supports habitat? We're going to want some of that density. We're getting our privacy, and we really want to block the view also at the ground level, but maintain things at the high level. To me, this is a perfect spot to do that habitat hedge concept, that close planting of some tallish shrubs of California native species that will go above the eye line but aren't going to become huge trees. And with those habitat hedge species, they can all be kind of trimmed to both sides. And so if I need to come around here and trim the backside of them over time so they don't get onto the neighbor's gravel strip, that will work out just fine. So how thick do we want to make this? We can figure this out eventually later, but for a lot of those hedge species, about 5 or 6 feet is going to be what you want to give. So for now, we'll just do 5 feet, and this might not end up being what we end up doing since we don't have our plant selection quite yet. Maybe we will end up choosing plants that need a little bit more space, but for now, just roughly. And remember again, plants don't grow in circles, so the idea would be that this might be a more full hedge. They're not going to be little orbs next to each other, topiaries. But here we have the idea of our habitat hedge. And this will do a couple of things for us. It'll provide that visual barrier. It'll have that plant density, and we'll still be able to see over it. And then as that visual barrier, that'll also be a visible backdrop for the rest of the planting. It's nice to work in layers. And so one thing that is very useful to think about as you think about your planting design is which views are going to be the most important. Is it going to be most important to be standing in the street looking at the house for that curb appeal? Is it going to be most important being inside the house, looking out? Are you really thinking about the walk up to the house for guests or visitors if you entertain a lot? Any of these things might be most important to you. To some degree, oftentimes we want to balance all of them, but sometimes there is a primary thing that is most important. So I will just say, for example, our goal here, the more we thought about it, was we want it to be lovely from the street, and through choosing the right species and making sure that we have some colorful stuff along the edge, we just said, yeah, we'll make sure that that happens in the planting design. We will kind of take that into account. We weren't really worried too much about the kind of visitors, their kind of approach coming in. We're not like throwing parties here all the time, and our landscape is very narrow in the front, and there's just not a lot of parking on the street. So if people do come to our house, if it's just one person, we have them park in our driveway. If it's a few people, they'll have to be parking pretty far away. And really the main walk, we figured, will probably have to be up along the driveway. We just didn't want to really keep things that open in the landscape that's small in the front. And so we decided after all of that, that our main concern in terms of really wanting to set up these beautiful, beautiful views was mostly going to be from the windows looking out, whether it's from the living room, whether it's from the front door, or from the two bedrooms that look this way, and really setting up a gorgeous view from there. Now, obviously, if we do that as well, then every time we leave the house or have the screen door open, we are also taking that all in. If we are greeting someone at the doorstep, we're taking that all in as well. And then with that, we also get the nice borrowed landscape of the mountains in the background to really set up lots of depth. So thinking about depth, even in a relatively small space, can you work with layers of planting? Small in front of medium, in front of large, in front of maybe the background landscape that exists off of the property. And so with thinking about this, we have our background that we've started to set up, and then we can start to think about what are the layers that we want to then build in front of that background. So it's a very logical process. You think about your goals, you can think about visually layers, background, middle ground, foreground, and thinking about that from whatever view is going to be the most important for you. And then also, as you start to think about your layers, think about access, whether that's a pathway through for visitors to take, whether that's for maintenance, or just visually. You don't want to shrub it all up in between and just have an impenetrable mass, even if it's of lovely plants for you to get into. So in this phase also, before you're worried about individual, this plant here, this plant there, you're going to think about layers, and you're going to think about access and pathways and any other features. So if you're thinking about a patio space or just a space that's going to be, unplanted, open mulch, or a gravel patio area and some furniture, start to think about all of that at that phase as well. Are you going to have a little space for a couple of lawn chairs and you want it to be shaded from the afternoon sun over time, and is it going to be kind of here so you can get from it right from your front walkway? That's not necessarily what we're going to be doing in this design, but this would be the time to be just loosely sketching all of that out. So just to finish the thought before we move on, and eventually we will loop back to the plant layout and layering, but just to give you an idea of what it is that I am talking about. So if we were talking about setting up some nice visual layering of shrubs and larger plants in the background and smaller plants, might be something kind of like this, where we have our trees and our taller habitat hedge in the back, and then we'll have some shrubs. A lot of our shrubs, not all, but a lot of our waterwise shrubs will be 5 or 6-ish feet wide, so we can just grab the 6-foot circle template. Maybe we'd want to leave a little bit of room to make sure we can maintain this habitat hedge, and then we'll have some shrubbery, 6, maybe we'll do 5. And remember that if you have a tree, towards the edge of the tree, we want to have some planting underneath the tree, especially if we're planting from a little plant, which we always should. Day one is going to be very open around. So we don't want to crowd the base of the tree and make it hard for the tree to grow in and not have enough room, but we can interact with what will eventually be the outside of that tree canopy. So we might have a shrub layer through here. And, probably wouldn't be an actual line like this. Have some shrubs. And so we have a tall layer in the background and then a smaller layer. And then we'd have smaller plants throughout here. Maybe a pathway that goes through and some shrubs in the front as well. Maybe smaller shrubs and taller shrubs, and then our tallest layer in the back. And along our pathway, let's say we had a pathway that started just where our steps to the house is, and if it went off this way, just as a place to get to some sort of destination. And then we might have our smaller perennial plants that are just, 18 inches a foot along there. Pathways, we'll talk more about later, about how wide they should be. And maybe there's going to be a little seating area. So at this stage, it can be this loose. Our pathway will go to a seating area, which is just room for a couple of lawn chairs, which will be a couple of feet wide. And maybe those chairs, maybe the best view here. We also want to take in our tree and our mountain view, so maybe our chairs, we'll set it up so there's room for our chairs here and a little coffee table. You know, something like that. And then we could have some smaller shrubs and some more small plants, maybe a bird bath. And then maybe up against the house, we want to make sure our view from the window is open, but maybe we have a shrub here and some room for a couple of, other taller shrubs to have some height up against just the bare, in my case, not particularly attractive plaster walls of the house. And then we still leave a little bit of open space. Maybe we move this shrub so we can walk just barely along the habitat hedge, enough kind of a little small way that we can get through and do some maintenance in the garden. Smaller plants along here, and maybe some wider low ground covers throughout here. Just kind of thinking about the space. So that it could be that rough for your first iteration. One thing that we definitely want to talk about, because we know it's going to be important for this plan and we want to bring it early on, is rainwater. So I just kind of got this far here because I just wanted to show how quick and easy it could be, starting with some simple goals. But there's two things that I do want to explore a little bit more to talk about, which are what to do with the rainwater, how to capture some of that rainwater, how to prevent our flooding issue, and then I do want to talk a little bit more about pathways. I mean, it can't be that simple, but I want to provide you with a little bit better of a guide. So what I'm going to do is, we had some good ideas here, but we're going to definitely refine them. So pull out our next sheet of tracing paper. And so if there's a couple of ideas on here that we like, we can capture those, but we don't need to keep all of this. And so our tracing paper, and what I will do is I'm going to tape this down in a couple of different places. So if I trace part of the layer directly underneath and then want to remove it, I can pull the tape off there and slide it out without needing to move this one. So there we go. And let's do our registration marks. Quick and easy, making sure that things aren't going to slide around on us. And so something that I am really liking, most likely, even though we'll refine the size later, is the idea of having these two small, medium-sized trees here. I'm wanting to hold on to that. It's because I think that that's going to be the way to get our privacy and still leave above those small trees our mountain views open. And this habitat hedge along here makes a lot of sense as well. Instead of doing the individual circles, I'm just going to kind of block out the size of that habitat hedge for now. So I'm going to hold on to those two ideas. But then I'm going to take a step backwards, because before I get to the small ideas of a shrub or a hedge here or there, I often like to make sure that I have figured out two of the things that are really going to set up the opportunities and the spatial constraints for the planting design, which are how I'm going to deal with rainwater, if I need a French drain or a dry stream bed, an infiltration basin, something like that. The reason why I like to get that figured out pretty early on is because oftentimes there are just, based on the size of a site, where the water wants to go, and the good opportunities to capture that water, the site's going to tell you where that needs to be. And then the plants can kind of work around it. And then a little bit similar is also where any patio, social space, any of that might want to be. That's something that can shift around over time, but oftentimes it's easier to think about that first and then think about how to plant around it rather than think about the planting first, and then by the time you're done with that, there's not really much of a space for a patio to be left. So that's why we like working on the tracing paper and the different layers, not messing with the base plan, because we're able to just slide that out. And I could always bring this back in and layer it back in if I want to capture it later on. But for now, I can have it off to the side and not in my way. And so let's think about this flooding issue that we have. And there could be a couple of approaches that I see on this site that could potentially work. So if this site was either completely flat and we had water coming down off the roof concentrated in these areas, or if this site sloped out towards the street in this direction, classic thing that one might want to do is to create a dry stream bed area, either by putting roof gutters on and having a downspout in a specific area. So for example, if we were able to put roof gutters on, or if you had pre-existing roof gutters, and it came along here, and maybe on a site like this, it can come along, and here would be a very common place to have the downspout, or if you wanted to replace it with the rain chain, that would be nice. And then you could have a nice dry stream bed that could pick up here and kind of meander out into the site in whatever shape you would want it to follow, and something nice and naturalistic. And maybe it'd be a little larger. And then you could put plants along it and a path that had a little bridge or, big stepping stone in the middle or something to get across it. That would be one way you could go. If you weren't going to have roof gutters and the site sloped out, and you had some gravity to follow, you could have something like a French drain, kind of a gravelly area that picked up water all along here. So maybe we might even go farther, got a 2-foot band of gravel, 18-inch, and you can make the bottom of that trench just slightly, that's filled with gravel, just slightly get deeper in this direction, just a little bit deeper in this direction. So it could start pretty shallow, maybe only 6 inches, and then by the time it gets here, maybe be a foot, and then that could kind of match the depth of the dry stream bed, which could also, this could all feed into the dry stream bed just by getting slightly deeper and slightly deeper. And this part could be filled with gravel right up against the house. And then it could open up into a more naturalistic dry stream bed, something like that. Or it could be simpler and it doesn't need to go necessarily out that far. It could kind of just go like that, whatever you want. However, this site was a little more limited because the slope of this site comes down this way. And so it brings the water from the driveway down, and then it kind of flattens out. So some of that water gets into this flood zone. If there is a big enough storm event that this landscape itself can't absorb all the water, which was especially true when it was kind of an old compact lawn, some of that water would come down as well. And in addition to all of that, the main source of water is just all the water coming off of this section of the roof would just kind of get trapped right along here. And because this area it's not an extreme slope, but it definitely, the elevation rises. We are downslope of the street. We are downslope in the house in this walkway area of the top of the landscape. We can't really work with a dry stream bed very well because if we tried to dig it deeper, we'd have to dig really deep as the landscape rises around it. That just generally becomes very difficult, a lot of work, and it's fighting the way the site wants to drain water. So we want to embrace the way the site wants to drain water. And so what makes sense on a site like this is to accept that water where it is, let some of it infiltrate in a small rain event, not right up against the house, but at least a little bit farther out, and then work with the fact that we have a side yard here and then a big backyard in the back. So can we get that water over and make use of it elsewhere? And so on a site like this, the more I thought about it for this site, the only thing that really made sense for me, especially with the fact that we weren't planning on putting roof gutters on, was that we would set up a French drain system, so a gravel-filled trench, that would go along this side of the walkway. So even though our flooding would be all through here, there's enough push of water coming off the roof this way that I felt that if we can, because there's not really much room to work on this side, and we have the steps to the house, and we're right up against the house here, I realized that if we put this gravel-filled trench kind of as the edge of the landscape, right on the edge of this walkway. It's a little more than a foot wide. And we carefully dug and found where the irrigation lines, the pipes that we were going to reuse were. Slightly less than a foot down, so that's as deep as we went because we didn't want to break through all those just to get more gravel. So we did that. And then the plan was going to be, if we needed to, we can come out on this side, and we were going to dig a hole and put a little open empty pipe in underneath the walkway. If you want to see step by step how that was installed, you can check out our Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes online workshop, available on our YouTube page, cbwcd.org/YouTube, and show how I did the site analysis, just specifically thinking about rainwater, and set up the water harvesting system for the front yard and the backyard of this property. And it also shows lots of other options in detail, so if you're thinking through that, I recommend that you take a look at that workshop. Should help you out quite a bit. And we were very constrained through this area. I'll make some lines just to indicate the area that we're thinking about here. We were very constrained through this area. French drain was sort of the only option. If we pushed any farther out to do like a dry stream bed, we'd be getting too far away from the flooding zone. I didn't want to have a dry stream bed starting right off the edge of the walkway where someone would like roll their ankle or fall into it. But if we pushed it out anymore, we're just not going to capture that water there. There's a small planting bed here, but there'd be no good way really to get the water from this side through here. And then we also have that infiltration area being kind of pretty close to the front of the house. There is this brick planter here, but along here is the chimney, and I just didn't want things that close in that area. But once we get here, we do have a little bit more open space. The walkway stops, and it's open landscape area right up until you get to the base of the house and the window right here. And so what we did here to also be able to collect a little bit more of this water is we let things get a little bit more natural, and we opened this up. The gravel came around a little bit, and we decided to open this up and have it start as a little bit more natural of an open dry stream bed. Not getting all the way up here, leaving some room for some plantings, but roughly kind of like that. And so here it's gravel just straight to the surface. Here we were able to mix in some rock. Eventually we mixed in some rock here just right at the top to make it look nice here. We were able to kind of plant it more like a dry stream bed where there's a little bit more depth down in the middle, and we could plant around it. And so we have this kind of transition, which happened very naturally, just with working with how much rock there was, where it's just as deep here. So in a small rain event, the water might filter in here, but in a large rain event, the water is going to follow just the natural slope of what's happening. So the walkway slopes slightly this way, and we just dug our depth and kind of slightly followed the walkway. So once this accumulates a lot of water, the water would come along here hits the end of this and then goes this way. And then once it rounds this corner, the whole property slopes down that way. So it would follow down that way along more French drain. This French drain is also taking any water that needs to wash off of the driveway, which is quite a bit on this side, and then eventually opens up into a bigger dry stream bed in the backyard where we have more room. But even if all we had to do, if we didn't want to do all that in the back, we weren't redoing the backyard, even if we just got this around to a landscape area in the backyard and out and away from the house, that would accomplish quite a lot. And so that's what we were planning on doing for here. And that makes a lot of sense. And a nice thing about the French drain too, as opposed to a dry stream bed in certain areas, and certainly this was the case here, is that if the gravel fill is all the way to the surface, then you can walk right across it. We don't need to have a bridge over a dry stream bed. A bridge over a dry stream bed can be a very nice feature. Depends on where it is and if you want that. But for here, it made it very convenient to be able to walk out into the landscape. And so the next thing we are going to think about is this seems like to be the only thing that's going to make a lot of sense for the landscape that at least came to me during the design process. And so that's done. This needs to be here based on the slopes and all of the factors. So getting this in before we get in too far deep into our planting plan. And then the other thing we want to think about are pathways and access, and do we want some sort of patio space? So another reason why I like thinking about rainwater harvesting first is because sometimes what might make a nice patio or a seating space is also going to overlap with what would be one of the options for kind of the most convenient or a nice patio space to think about. So it could have been logical to think, well, walk right outside and there's this landscape area. Maybe we should develop this deeper area to have just a few foundation plantings and then a nice place to put a couple of chairs and look out into the landscape and really pull in that whole depth. Well, we did our rainwater harvesting first, because this is going to take priority. We need to do something in that area. If we put a nice patio space here, that's going to be the area that gets inundated whenever it rains in the winter. And there might be ways to kind of combine some of those functions with like a deeper gravel patio, but we have other spaces to think about here. So where would we want to enter the landscape, and where would we want to kind of spend time in the landscape? And also, when you're thinking about patio spaces, think about how much space do you need? Is it for 2 chairs and a side table, just for you and one other person to spend time in, or is it going to be for the whole family to sit around an outdoor table and eat dinner? In reality, patio space was not one of the goals for this project because we have a medium-sized front yard and a huge backyard, and we do all of that in the backyard where we can build gardens and all sorts of plantings, plenty of room around plenty of patio space. But I want to include some of these ideas in case you're considering it for your front yard, because a small front yard patio space is quite lovely. And so what you want to think about is where would be a nice place to be surrounded by plants, to get shade if possible in the afternoon and early evening, because if you are in inland Southern California, you definitely want some afternoon shade, so shade on the west side of your patio space in order to make that space kind of habitable. And what direction do you want to look in? And so really, if we are committing to having our small trees here because we are going to want to block the views, then this is where our shade is going to come from as well. So if we didn't have our mountain views as a priority, we can say, oh, let's put a big oak tree in here, which I would be very tempted to do if it wasn't for the mountain views, and if we didn't have an oak tree in our backyard. And then eventually our patio space will be kind of on the east side of that underneath and can kind of look out into the landscape. But I think for here, if we were going to do that, we would need to embrace the fact that we are going to have our small trees here, and we are going to want to have a patio space nestled to get the afternoon shade of that small tree. And so this would be very similar to a lot of the patio designs that you see detailed on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, they have a small/medium sized tree, and then either a bench or a couple of chairs and a table kind of nestled up to it, and can capture some of that shade with then some plantings around. And so this would be kind of the zone. And now we want to think about, well, okay, how big do we want it to be? The best thing to do, always encourage it, I do it myself, is if you know kind of what style of chairs you have, if you already have the chairs, put them out, even if it's just in the empty landscape, put them out, drag a table out there, or if you don't have those chairs yet, but even bringing out just briefly the dining room chairs or some folding camp chairs, whatever you have, but put a couple of chairs out there. Realize that outdoor chairs tend to be a little bit bigger if you don't have them yet, but just kind of feel it out, however many chairs you need. If you're going to have room for a side table or something like that, or an outdoor coffee table, either put it out there or grab a couple of storage bins or just something to block out that space, or grab a bag of flour and just kind of draw out roughly the sizes of things, and then measure how much space you think you would need around it. And kind of from there you can make notes about how many feet by how many feet you want your patio space to be that's going to feel right to you. Because there are no great standards for it. It's about the size of the stuff you're going to have and what feels right. The other thing you can do is if you have a friend or if someone in the neighborhood has a front yard that you think, the patio space looks exactly like what you would want, ask them if you can take some measurements. Go over with the measuring tape and literally measure it out, take some pictures, and that could be something that you can emulate. But don't make it way too big, but don't also try to squeeze every foot of planting space in and make it too small. Kind of, do what you need. So a lot of outdoor chairs are going to be about 2 feet wide. The actual seat's going to be a little bit smaller. And if you even haven't bought yours yet, but you know which ones you're going to get, look up the information about it. You can oftentimes find the size it's going to be. About 2 feet. The ones that I like, that I often use, are a little bit wider than that in the front, and so you can kind of figure it out. There's 2 feet in the back, 2 squares, a little bit wider in the front. That's roughly going to be the size of one of those chairs. And then maybe one more. But we're going to want room for a table in between, a little side table. So I just guessed on the size, but we are roughly, and you see how weird that is. You don't need to be an artist. That's why it's nice to have a good eraser, even if we're working with tracing paper. So, the angle, and now I'm seeing the whole thing, if we want to get some of that shade, would probably push back. So you can roughly, or you can, again, make a little cutout of the size of your chairs and kind of move them around. You can be loose and have fun with it. So, but we also know that we want it to be looking out into the garden, though. It's starting to get at a kind of weird angle. So over time, maybe we're going to be kind of here, here. The table in between. And so this is where we're kind of trying to push and pull things up. The angle that you can see that this wants to, go on Momo, the angle that this wants to be isn't quite aligning with the tree. And really, I guess the patio is going to need to move a little bit more around the side if we were going to do this. A little bit more over here. And this is maybe pushing things a little too close to the edge of the driveway, but you can see that's why we just do this on scratch paper, and that's why you also go out into the site and feel out what's going to work. And then once you kind of have that, you figure out, well, how much space do you need around it? You want room for your feet, you want to be comfortable, you want to be able to walk up to your stuff, so probably at least minimum of 2, better about 3 feet in front of your chairs, your area. It's going to be mostly to be left open. And what I like to do is I always like to plan for a little bit more walkway space in front of where the chairs are going to go. This is my design apprentice right here. Excuse me, buddy. I always like to plan a little bit more space, which means I can plant a little bit closer, and then if the plants overlap the edge, it's kind of nice and natural looking, rather than me needing to cut them back because I don't have enough room to walk. And so we have, we figure out roughly this will be the space. And then on the final version of this plan, if we were going to stick with this, maybe we would nudge the tree out a little bit more to give it some more room. And then we certainly would trace over it with a neater line. But that's, again, the nice thing about just being able to scribble out ideas. And then the other thing we need to think about is our pathways and access. And so where do we want our pathway and our access to start? Like I mentioned, if there was going to be a lot of inviting friends in from the front, maybe we'd have a pathway that would come in off of here. This is one of the good reasons why, especially if you're thinking about access off the sidewalk through the landscape, it's really good to have your water meter and your utilities marked out, because it would be super awkward for the pathway to be cut off or go partway over your concrete water meter box. And so, we need to kind of choose a side. It would probably be here where we would want to bring the pathway in if we wanted to, and then it can maybe give an opportunity to sit and then come and then head towards the door. So this is the logical way for the pathway to start coming out of the house. You'd be able to choose going to the driveway or also then coming directly out of the house. And when I'm thinking about pathways, it's kind of scribbles of the center line, thinking about the best path of travel. And, we already decided here that we're not really worried. I'd rather have plants along the edge. Any visitors can walk up the driveway and then come around. And so from here we would, maybe go by our patio space, and then we would walk out into the main landscape. For access, for maintenance, maybe the ability to get to the hedge and leave a little bit of open space through here. And if you have a natural landscape, you want to kind of think about a nice, not too complicated meander. So you can see that was a little bit awkward. And so we can refine that. What would be a more natural, kind of graceful arc. And then maybe there's an opportunity for another point of interest. So because this has a habitat focus, one of the things I'm going to want to do is maintain a bird bath, and I'm going to want to put it somewhere practical where it's easy enough to keep clean. I have a hose bib right here, so I want to be able to stretch the hose. For our bird baths, we also want to make sure that we can see them from our windows. The best time to observe birds in your garden is actually going to be when you're inside the house. Some more bold species of birds, or once you've been out inside your garden and you've been quiet for a while, they'll come back around. But they'll really bathe with the most abandon, and you'll see some of the best bird action in your yard when you're inside, being able to see them out enjoying themselves in the bird baths. And that goes for me as well as for my cats that spend time in these rooms wanting to see out. So I'm going to try to have a bird bath as a feature that can be seen from views from both these windows. So from here looking that way, from here looking that way, and that'll put the logical spot for our bird bath somewhere around here. A little B for bird bath, so I don't confuse it with the plant later on. And so that sets us up pretty nicely to have a main pathway through the landscape that goes through here. Maybe we'll have just a little gap in the plants, maybe not, just for doing maintenance so we can get out to the street there. And then being able to work along the hedge. And then also access the window should we need to. So that kind of makes sense. There's definitely lots of other ways that it can be done, but this is just one iteration. And again, we're not going to go through iteration after iteration in this example of how the pathway might go for this design layout, because trying to keep this relatively short, it's going to be a long video anyways, but you might want to do layer after layer of tracing paper, try all sorts of different things. It's easy to experiment with different ideas now and land on what you really think is the best idea for your spot. Much more difficult once you're actually have materials and plants in the ground. So don't just go with your first idea. Maybe your first idea will end up being the one that you go with later on, but challenge yourself. Try to do 2, 3, 5 different ideas, whatever you want. And then once you kind of figure out the path of travel for your pathway, you are going to want to think about how wide should that be. Now, if you're going to have a pathway that you walk along with like a kind of singular surface, whether that's wood chips or gravel or decomposed granite, there's going to be a width to it. If you're doing stepping stones, it's just going to be the width of whatever stepping stones that you choose to do. So you're not going to worry as much about the width of the pathway if you're doing stepping stones. Generally, what I recommend, just like the edges of patios, is that you give yourself maybe a little bit more space than you think you're going to need for the pathway, because inevitably some of the plants along the edges of the path are going to grow a little bit more into it. And if you say, oh, a 1.5 foot pathway is enough for me to walk through, I just really want to be able to sneak through the landscape to get around, I'd rather cram more plants in, inevitably what will happen is that some of the plants will grow a little bit wider than you're expecting, and that pathway could just disappear like that. So if you give yourself a little more space for the pathway, I really encourage people for most residential pathways to plan out 3 feet at least of space, maybe even 4 if it's going to be a major pathway. 5 feet is like 4.5 feet, 5 feet, it's like a sidewalk. That's going to be too big for the average size residential landscape. But what's nice with a good 3 foot wide pathway is that you have some space, so that if you have a 3 foot wide pathway and plants grow over the edge, and then you have a 2 foot wide pathway, and then in a spot or two maybe it even goes down to 18 inches, that's still passable. You have a little bit of room to lose and still have a nice kind of grown in look. And so in order to then kind of start to plan out your 3 foot wide pathway, you can do a couple of things. So because we have our 3 foot wide because we have our 1 square is 1 foot on this scale grid, what we can do is we can take a look at where our kind of center line just happens to kind of come through the middle of a square and kind of go 1.5 squares in each direction. And that's going to be roughly a 3 foot wide pathway. And we can kind of plan that out, a few other reference spots, and then go from there. Or you can actually get out here with the ruler. So we know that 3/4 of an inch is going to be 3 inches, it's going to be our 3 foot wide pathway. And then you can kind of feel it out like that. I'm just going to do some registration marks kind of here and there along the path until I could kind of eyeball. So if our pathway comes in right here, that's going to be roughly like that. And maybe in the final version of this, I'll measure it out a little bit more, but we're still working pretty conceptually. It's somewhat rough for now, and I'm not going to leave the full 3 feet along the hedge. Really, this is just a smaller area for me to make sure I have room to step in and do some maintenance. And from there, you can kind of just, whatever curve you are planning on, you can kind of define that out. It doesn't need to be exact. You can try to be exact when you're actually laying it out on the site. And so what are we going to do here? Here our bird bath would be kind of at the edge of the pathway. I made that too big. And so maybe what we do here then is we push our bird bath back out just a little bit, and then we can do some plantings right around it, something kind of like that. So that could be a way to go. And then we'll open things up. We'll kind of include this little patio space, and we can kind of sketch it out to where we have a little bit of a nicer, kind of more gradual shape. And then if we want to clean it up some, we can already start to do that so we can see how this would come together a little bit nicer. It's a planning document. It doesn't need to be a work of art. So here we go. So that's a little bit about how you might think about patios and pathways, just in a nutshell. And so that would leave us with a nice plan already. Again, we're not thinking about species yet. We're not worrying about which landscape design template quite yet. We are about to get to that, but that gives us kind of what we structurally need in our landscape to meet our general goals. We're getting our privacy, we're preserving our mountain view, we have our physical access, we're dealing with our water and flooding issue. We're turning this rainwater nuisance into a resource to harvest it and help soak it into the ground, give our garden a deep soak in a light rain, and help recharge the groundwater in a good rain season. From here, we can now start to think about how we want to incorporate our plants, our planting styles, and start to bring in the templates. And so what we are going to do is I am going to do one other layer really quickly just to kind of clean this up some, and then we will use that layer as the base layer to start working our planting design using inspiration from the templates over. Let's pull out a piece of tracing paper. Come on, there we go. Clear off some of this eraser. Check that our registration marks are still looking good. And because we have these basics, because we've taken into account the flooding situation, because we've taken into account the mountain view a bit, the feels too open, we're starting to kind of feel that in. Taken into account the fact that it feels too open, we're starting to enclose this space just a little bit. What I'm going to do now is probably on this, what'll be kind of our base layer till we work out our planting design, is I'm going to incorporate the most important things from the work we just did with the things that continue to be most important from our site assessment for our planting design. And that way I can remove multiple layers underneath and clean things up a little bit. So we'll have the simplest possible base as we start to get more and more shapes. We don't want it to get too congested and illegible. So what I did is I just sharpened a bunch of pencils before I started, and I've been kind of swapping them out as they get dull. But make sure you're continuing to work with a sharp pencil, especially as we start getting into planting design and we might be working with smaller plants. Keep your pencil sharp and it'll make everything a little bit easier. So, as always, we're starting with our registration marks. Oop. I kind of taped over them a little bit here, but as long as we get part of that line, we will be good. And so, what are our most important things that we want to capture here? Probably tree, another tree, our main hedge area, our bird bath, and then some sort of path of travel. And I'm not even going to worry about the edges. I'm just going to kind of keep the idea of there's this kind of center line path of travel. Those are going to be the most important ideas to bring forward. Also, the French drain opening up to kind of be the mini dry stream bed, little collection basin. It's going to be something that we're going to stick with. I'm actually not going to do the patio. Like I mentioned, that wasn't a priority for this project because we have plenty of social space in the backyard. This is more of a landscape habitat area, something to look out of the house at, something to beautify the street a little bit. So that's just an example for if you happen to be planning that. And with that, that gives us really the most important shapes to work with. So we will flip this up. We're going to pull this out. And I was thinking when I was first talking about that I would trace some of these other ideas, the water line, the seasonal shade line, when we get into the planting. And I just put the simpler scale-based plan underneath. But I think for now I'm going to leave it. Again, there's no one size fits all way to do this. It's whatever's going to work best for you at whatever project you're working on. So let's leave it for here. And so now we're going to start thinking a little bit more. We're not going to be a final planting design yet, but we're kind of spiraling around. So now we are going to start thinking about plants, the sizes of plants, and turning to our templates to look for inspiration. So there were a couple of templates that really jumped out to me as the ones that would make sense for this list of goals, with the habitat, wanting to provide a sense of privacy and shelter. And just to be kind of full disclosure, I created this actual landscape, and you'll see pictures of it later, before we created all of these templates. However, there's kind of some resonance. So we're going to look at this as if it was a new project, as if we were using the templates, and then as we wrap around to the end, I will do, in the final example, show you pretty much what we actually ended up doing with the site in reality. But to meet this list of goals, and in fact integrating many of the plants that we did use in this landscape project, two of the templates jump out right away. And that's the songbird and butterfly garden, as well as the woodland garden. If you want to use the templates, you can actually kind of pull things together relatively quickly. And we're going to do it extra quickly. If you're working on your own, or if I was really doing a design for someone, I would definitely go a little bit slower. I would take more time, but you can start to get to it pretty quickly. So what you are going to want to do is, if you're thinking about emulating one of these templates, before you go forward, really spend some good time with it. Maybe download the PDF package and look at the examples across all of the sizes. Look at the perspective examples, look at the bird's eye view examples, and those line up exactly. So the perspectives, the more kind of semi-realistic looking ones, those follow exactly the bird's eye view planting plans. It's if one of them had grown in, and that's exactly what it would look like. We kind of aligned what we did in the computer programs to make that work. And so if you like the look of a plant combination, you can check it out on the bird's eye view plan and look roughly at the spacing that those plants were done in the plan, and look at the perspective. Another reason why you might want to go back and forth between some of them is that some of them look, very, very grown in, like there wouldn't even be any room to walk. When you look at the perspective, the more kind of semi-realistic looking ones. But then when you look at it from the bird's eye view point of view, you can see that there actually is a little bit more space sometimes left in between the plants, but just then if you are standing there looking at it, the way that the plants layer from any one perspective, you don't see it as much. So you can kind of see how some of that came together. You can see the size that we left for each of the plants, and some of the plants do get a little bit bigger, so if you see some extra gaps left in between them, that's to accommodate it. We really just kind of tried to turn this into the clearest planning document so you can emulate the plant combinations if you want, or any of the things going on. And so in addition to taking a look at those, I'd also encourage you to start to create like the plant list that you want for your space. And so that might be all of the plants in a template, and that'd be fine. That gives you lots to choose from. But you can also look up those plants individually, see the pictures of them on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, and if some of them, read the descriptions, and if some of them just, aren't your thing, then that makes your life a little bit easier. You can eliminate some of them. At the same time, if there's other plants that, because you've done your research, you're thinking about right plant, right place, are going to be compatible with the template that you are using, but they're not in that template, that's fine too. Write them down, note the size, if there are other factors about it that you want to use, anything in particular, like some plants, we might type in there like, looks really great when you see it backlit in the early morning or afternoon. Anything that you might want about how specifically to use it, make all of those notes, have them, on another piece of note paper or on a computer, tablet, whatever you do, off to the side. Probably need a bigger note paper than this, and kind of pull together your resources. Now, if that sounds like it's a lot to you and you just want to look at a template, kind of find one that's the same relative size as your landscape and go from there, totally fine. That's another very legitimate way to do it as well. Make it as custom or as close to the templates as you want. And so, for example, this is a 1,200 square foot yard, so not quite a large landscape, kind of a medium size, maybe a medium large kind of landscape. And so what I am going to be doing for this first example is I will pull some inspiration from the medium and large approaches to the songbird and butterfly garden. And I am pulling those up on my computer right now. And so I'm going to have those bird's eye view plans open and kind of look at the plant combinations and certain things that I might want to emulate from those plant combinations for this. And you also might want to look at, for example, the extra large, no matter what size you have, because for the extra large landscape, sometimes in these examples, the extra large landscapes have a variety of different things that they need to accomplish, and it's a much larger space. And so, for example, in the butterfly and songbird garden template, the medium and large gardens don't really have a true large, hedge that will block the view of, an adult standing, which is what we want for here. But the extra large version does have that larger hedge and some great plant combinations for that. So, because of that, kind of look at all of them and you can kind of pull what you want, ideas from each one, even within a template. And again, if that sounds too complicated and you just want to emulate one, that's fine. And so right now, I actually, as I looked through them, I saw some really nice ideas, even in the extra large one. I can't do everything that's there, but I saw some nice ideas in the extra large one that I do think I might want to emulate. So I pulled that up and let's take a look at what we might want to do. So first, let's see if we can make some decisions about the trees and the hedge, since we're pretty close anyways. We know that we're going to have probably that layering that we talked about, the shrubs, the smaller plants. But once we get down to a template, like for example, in the butterfly and songbird, we have 3 trees to choose from. We have western redbud, desert willow, and toyon. All great large shrubs that can be pruned up into small trees. And then we have some larger shrubs as well. We have California coffeeberry. We have hollyleaf cherry, which are both really nice, taller evergreen shrubs. We have sunset manzanita, which over time gets tall, but it's a kind of slower grower. And then we have some medium-sized shrubs. We have Allen Chickering sage, which gets very wide, but still will only be hip, maybe chest high. Also, we have Palmer's mallow, kind of roughly same scale, and Santa Cruz Island buckwheat, which gets about 5 feet wide, but really won't be much more than thigh high. So those are going to be in that middle layer. And then we also have golden currant, which can be 6 feet high or so, maybe even a little taller, but has a very open form and is a really great habitat plant, but it's kind of a hot mess. It goes pretty dormant sometimes in the summer. It kind of flops around and does its thing. So it's an awesome plant, but wouldn't be something that we choose for the habitat hedge. And so setting us up with some pretty good ideas then, it sounds like from this template, the main plants that would work really well for this habitat hedge would be the hollyleaf cherry and the California coffeeberry. And that sounds good to me. And both of those are going to work pretty well along this whole area as well, because they can both take a good amount of shade, but they can also both take full sun even in the inland heat. And so remember, we have to think about the seasonal shade area on the north side of the house, and all the plants we put in here to perform well need to be able to be either adapted to the full sun of summer or the significant shade during the parts of the year, especially the winter and the early spring, the late fall when the sun is lower in the south side of the sky. So we're bringing back a lot of these ideas that we've talked about. And so something that we could do is if we look at the extra large, how they have a kind of long hedge, and that's a barrier, and there's 3 holly leaf cherries and 3 California coffee berries. And I kind of like that idea. But what I'm thinking about is because it's a naturalistic kind of landscape, instead of the hedge just kind of being a block like this, maybe we'll want to put some movement into it. And to do that, I'm thinking maybe that we kind of have a little bit of a curving shape instead of going straight. Maybe it curves off at the end. And what also that might let me do is that might let me have a little bit of spot of planting right here, maybe one little colorful perennial kind of facing the street, so that way this hedge isn't really kind of just like turning its back to the neighborhood. It's a little pop of color, something smaller, another little layer, so it's not just a wall that's separating the garden from the street and anyone passing by. And with hedges, sometimes you will kind of bring the plants a little closer together. Now, to be clear, in the templates, we are allowing 5 feet width for the coffee berry and the holly leaf cherry used this way. If they're just put individually in the middle of the garden, over time they will often get quite a bit wider. But in a hedge situation, we can be easily maintaining it with pruning just 2 or 3 times a year in most cases to stay within that range. And so here we can see how many of these we can fit at 5 feet or a little bit closer. I'll even back it just a little bit more off the property line, give myself a little bit more space. And these plants are roughly the same size, and that makes it a little bit easier to plan. We can kind of look at how many we have space for, and then decide exactly what we want for the numbers of each species. And so when I'm working on a hedge, working it out, I'll do a little bit from one side, and sometimes a little bit from the other side, because we know exactly where we want our last ones to be. In the middle, we can kind of push and pull things a little bit. So it looks like we'll make these a little bit closer to each other, and that gives us a nice even number. And so that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plants. And I think instead of going half and half, I'm thinking about the views from the different windows. I think I might want to go a little bit more with the coffee berry and just have the cherry as something to break it up over here at the end. And so what you can do, there's a couple of things you can do at this point in time. I'm going to work with just some initials, and then you can note them down. Or you can just come up with whatever you want. Eventually we might color code these, but for now, just to keep it in one color and make it easy to erase if we change species, we'll work with initials, and I'll tell you kind of what that means. So for example, if you look for here, the holly leaf cherry. So if you wanted to, you could, for holly leaf cherry, the initial, you can do HC. I just like to have my initials normally be 2 letters, because if it's just 1 letter, sometimes that letter starts to repeat, and there's multiple plants that can be assigned. With 2 letters, that problem happens less often, and you can just come up with another solution. So here, just HC. And then when I start working on that somewhere off to the side, we're not going to be putting plants on the neighbor's property, so we can just do HC equals holly leaf cherry. HC. And then for the other one is California coffee berry, we'll do CC. CC, CC, C, CC, CC equals California coffee berry. So what about our trees? So in our template, we have those 3 to choose from: Western Redbud, Desert Willow, and Toyon. And if you prefer to bring in a different tree that you know is going to work because you've done your research with the other plants that you are thinking about, that's just fine as well. But for now, we're going to stick to the template. And we have some choices to make. Western redbud and desert willow are both deciduous trees, so they will lose their leaves in the winter and have a more open form in the winter. Toyon is an evergreen tree, or evergreen large shrub. These are all really large shrubs that can be pruned up into trees, and so Toyon will keep its leaves year-round. They're all great habitat plants. They're all kind of compatible. Of those three, desert willow really wants to be in full sun. Western redbud and Toyon are perfectly happy in full sun, but they can also take some shade. So those are some other considerations. In terms of the size, Western redbud is sometimes a bit smaller. Western redbud in a home garden is normally 10 feet to 15 feet-ish wide. Toyon and desert willow are going to be able to be pruned to stay a little bit smaller, but those are going to be more 15 to 20 feet, occasionally even a little wider, wide, but can be kept to 15 feet, no problem. And so that gives us some choices. And then you can also look at what they're good for with habitat, the look, and all of that. But for me, choosing between those plants that I love, I knew I was going to put desert willow in my backyard, so that's going to go in the backyard. And that gives me Toyon and Western redbud. The tree right here, this is the one that's really going to provide a bit of privacy to this window that is my living room, that I really want to have something nice to look at other than the driveway. And so for me, this is going to be the priority for the one to be evergreen, where the one up here, I'd actually be okay with that being deciduous. It's going to be multi-trunk. All three of these are multi-trunk large shrubs that can be turned into small trees with some pruning. And so a multi-trunk kind of deciduous tree is still going to provide a little bit of sense of barrier and privacy even when it loses its leaves in the winter. And so with that, I think we can go ahead, and I'm not going to even actually worry about initials for these for now, because they're just the two trees. We can do Toyon, and we can do Redbud Western. And where exactly are these going to go? Now it's time to refine it. So something that we want to think about in terms of access is the driveway. When you have a relatively narrow driveway and there is a lawn, which is what this site used to be, it's okay if you park on a narrow driveway and open the door because you're just going to be walking down the lawn. When you are replacing your lawn with a beautiful Waterwise landscape that does more than your lawn ever did, something you still need to think about is access, because that's one thing that is easy with a lawn, is you can walk over it. And so we want to maintain essentially a pathway that's not going to get planted, and this is also going to be something we need to roll trash cans up and things like that, of about 3 feet off of this area, that we can have upper tree branches connected to it or going over it. That'll be even quite nice, but we don't want low branches right next to the base of the tree, and we do not want smaller plants really growing too far into that area. So when you have an odd angle like this, even though each square is 1 foot, it is kind of hard to actually count feet. So pull out your ruler. Remember, 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. So for our 3 foot wide path, if we want to get it in there, we'll kind of try to match the angle roughly to make a mark. It's going to be straight across, or a 90-degree angle here, and we'll mark at 3/4 of an inch. We'll do it in a couple of places, 3/4 of an inch, and then out towards the street, 3/4 of an inch. And so this is going to be the pathway that we need. And then we could line up our straight edge. I like to flip over the ruler, just makes a nice clean line. And so this is going to be pathway. And so here, this is actually feeling slightly close. So I'm going to erase this. And if you wanted to, you can, start a new page, but for me, for here, we'll just erase this. There's going to be plenty of erasing. It's not a bad idea if you're picking up a box of pencils to just get a big eraser. You will use it. And also, now that we're really thinking about the size, we're going to mark down our red bud at probably 12 feet, knowing it might get a little bit bigger. And our toyon will still mark down at like 15 feet. And so, let's see, for our red bud, the outer parts of the red bud could just be going into the path, but we really don't want, the red bud kind of likes to branch, the most beautiful ones branch pretty low, so we don't want to have it be too close to the edge of the path. So I'm actually going to end up moving this in quite a bit for the design. And then roughly mark it in the center. And that could be good. So redbud, western redbud. And for the toyon, that's going to stay a little bit bigger. The toyon is a little bit easier to prune, kind of up and out. And we do, because this window is so far over and the angle is so weird, I do want to have the toyon be kind of as close to the path as comfortably possible. So, yeah, we'll probably leave it somewhere around here. And then we'll move it up just a little bit. That'll also allow a little bit more edge planting right along here. And so we'll do something like that. And here would be our 12. And we're going to add about 1.5 feet onto each side to get to roughly 15, like we did before. And this will be the roughly projected canopy of our toyon. Okay, so making progress. We have our bird bath probably going to be here. And now we can start to think about how we actually want to layer our landscape. And what I like to do at this point in time is think about, before I think about this here, this here, this here, kind of create some zones and think about what species would go where. And so knowing how we want to kind of layer our landscape some, we have, like what we talked about earlier, there's probably going to be a zone roughly through here, not all the way to the path maybe, roughly through here, where we're going to have maybe some medium-sized shrubs, maybe some larger ornamental grasses through here. I'll just do this lightly because I'll erase it later. And they might come a little bit lower, and then we know we'll probably have some lower plants and perennials along the edge of our dry stream bed. And those will need to take the seasonal shade. We might have some shrubs kind of framing the windows as well. So we'll have sunshade. We'll probably have some buildup and transition between shrubs and perennial plants through here, but along our pathway, we'll probably have some smaller perennials that are going to be in full sun. And then we'll want plants that can take a little bit more water around our bird bath. Probably largely some low ones. And then the last thing that I did want to make sure with enclosing this area more is that we do want to make sure that for like the neighborhood, just so we're not turning our back too much, we're going to have some pops of color. And so these will still be kind of full sun perennials, but we'll kind of have till the redbud grows into shady there. And even as like the mailman is walking up the driveway, we'll have some zones through here that'll be pretty much full sun. Along here, our hot microclimate, remember our reflected heat. Now the pathway is going to take the worst of it along the driveway, but still this is going to be pretty hot western direct sun until this toyon and redbud grow in a lot of the year. And so now I'm going to kind of make some just kind of categories of what I might want to put in there. Now this may or may not end up in my final design. I might not use all the plants in each category, so I'll do it on a piece of scratch paper to the side. But for the shrubs, I might want to use, and some of this I'm going to pull also directly from the Inland Valley Garden Planner examples, but I still just helps my mind organize them to kind of put them on my own list, and if for some reason there's any ones that I want to kick out of the equation, I can do that. So what are going to be my middle-sized shrubs that I could really use in the middle? We have Palmer's Mallow. That'll be about 5 feet. And these are all, I encourage you to look up the profiles of each of these plants if you're thinking about using a template ahead of time, so you've read about their needs, how to use them. You can always refer back, have pictures, so have your computer right next to you so you can be looking at these things as you go. We also have Sunset Manzanita, and for the sake of the plan, we're putting it as 5 feet. Over time, it can get to be larger, but oftentimes by then it's kind of pruned up a little bit into kind of like a vase shape to expose the beautiful lower red limbs, the red wood, and you can see pictures of that on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Kind of a smaller, but not very small, we have the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. A little shorter, but still about 5 feet wide. We have Eve Case Coffee Berry. That is a dwarf, about 5, maybe 6 feet wide, but normally no more than hip height tall version of the California coffee berry. I'm going to skip that from our shrub list because we already have this backdrop of California coffee berry. I'm not going to need any more of those in this little area. We have in that shrub list the holly leaf cherry that we're using the taller one, and so we're looking for things a little bit smaller. We have Allen Chickering sage. Here again for planting we have that at 6 feet. It can be maintained at 6 feet. In inland empire gardens with good drainage, they tend to get very happy. If they're not pruned, I've seen them act. There's actually one in my backyard that's in a space where it has lots of room to grow. That's gotten to be 10 feet wide, which is quite wide. But with pruning a couple times a year, 6 feet is reasonable. And so we will keep that there. And then for some of our other shrub options, so we have Howard McMinn Manzanita, which is listed here in the extra large as a 4 foot wide plant. It naturally will get quite a bit wider, but it's used in a sort of hedge situation and can be clipped to stay that wide. But for here, we're going to preference the Sunset Manzanita. They're both awesome plants, but as like a single kind of beautiful specimen, which is probably how we would use it, we can go with Sunset Manzanita for here. And then the other one we have that we might consider for here, because it is large enough, is Desert Mallow. That's a sort of botanical cousin of Palmer's Mallow. They both have light foliage, they both have orange flowers, they're both great habitat plants. Desert Mallow is a little bit kind of floppier and wild. Palmer's Mallow is a little bit, I guess you could say, more picturesque. But Desert Mallow often will bloom a little bit longer and seems to be just, if anything in our areas, maybe a slightly better habitat plant. They're both great though. And that one, again, could be wider than 4 feet, but we'll plant about 4 feet wide. Sometimes it flops and gets a little bit bigger, but that works. And then grasses. Bunch grasses are great, kind of mixed in with shrubs. They visually kind of are a break for things. And in California native landscapes, if anything, aesthetically, they can get a little bit shrubby, a shrub, a shrub, a shrub, a shrub. And they're awesome shrubs, but having a big bunch grass like deer grass can kind of break that up some, bring in a little bit of a meadowy feel. And they're also a great habitat plant, so deer grass. Here we have it listed as 4 feet. One thing to know about deer grass, just a note, and you'll see in how we use it, the grass part itself in deer grass gets about 4 feet wide. However, it has this great spray of flowers that stay on the plant, and you really only need to cut it back normally every 2 or 3 years. And the flowers are narrow, so they don't fall apart. And so with that, the flowers will lay out a whole other foot in each direction. So deer grass, if you have it just around other plants, other shrubs and things like that, that can kind of hold their own, it's okay to consider it a 4-foot plant because the other shrubs will kind of interact with the flowers of the deer grass. But if you're putting it near the edge of a walkway, near the edge of a path, consider it a 6-foot wide plant, because if you don't give it that extra foot on either side for those flowers to naturally kind of reach the ground, then you're going to have to start cutting those off and things going to look like it had a weird lopsided haircut. So give it some space. So we'll use it either as a 4-foot wide plant or a 6-foot wide plant. And then one of the other things that I love to do, and we're going to emulate it in this design, is if you look in the extra large butterfly and songbird garden, you can see there's kind of an area where it's in the middle, it's a bunch of deer grass, and then there is showy penstemon interspersed here and there, and leaving just a little bit of an extra gap, and then letting the really tall spring flowers of the showy penstemon kind of come up in between the deer grass is just an amazing look. The hummingbirds love it, the pollinators love it, and then after those blooms fade and it needs to get cut back, they just kind of are a small green mound that kind of goes away. You don't really notice it that much. They're there, they're okay, but then they're really showstoppers when those flowers come up again in the spring. And so even though that's a perennial, it gets quite tall. The flowers with it can get 5 feet tall if they're happy. So we will put that in the mix because we'll probably be using it with our deer grass. Showy penstemon. With the leaves, they'll get about 3 feet wide. And one other shrub that I almost forgot, which is not in our extra large design, which I was using as our reference, but is on our main plant list for the palette, is the California bush sunflower. Great habitat plant, lots of flowers, very beautiful in the spring, early summer, and the flowers turn into awesome birdseed afterwards, and that can get up to 6 feet wide, and in inland valley gardens it normally does, so we would definitely leave it 6 feet. I'm not sure if we'll use this one in here, but we'll put it on our list. And so that's our list of shrubs we're going to be considering, and then we'll look at the smaller plants. And there's one plant which is technically it's a shrub. It's in the shrub list, but it's smaller than the other shrubs. It's a shrub because it is more of a woody plant, but that's creeping barberry. And we're definitely going to use creeping barberry, I already know, because it's one of my favorite plants for a north-facing kind of foundation, low, kind of knee-high-ish, really structural, looks great year-round. It's a very small shrub along the base of a house, and I'm pretty sure we'll end up using it in that manner. So creeping barberry, and that slowly spreads wider and wider. It's easy to keep contained if you want it to, but about 3 feet is a pretty common just for design. It'll fill into 3 feet in a couple of years. So we have creeping barberry in our smaller plants list, and then we're going to get to the smaller kind of spots of color and the perennials along the path in the full sun. And this list has a lot of my favorites. We have red buckwheat, about 2 to 3 feet wide in the garden. For planting purposes, we'll consider it about 2 feet. If we do it near a path, we'll maybe give it a little bit of extra room. We also have Margarita foothill penstemon, or also called Margarita bop penstemon. That's sometimes considered 1 to 2 feet. Occasionally I see it a bit larger, but we'll call it 2 feet for the purposes of this design. Another great one, can take full sun or partial shade. Also for our full sun or partial shade areas, we have lilac verbena. This one is a little bit bigger. It's almost like a small shrub, although it doesn't get super woody. So it is considered a bit more of a perennial plant. And that's going to, in inland, sometimes get kind of large, knee-high, maybe a little bit taller. All of the kind of reading you'll do about it, say 2 to 4 feet wide. I usually see it at least 3 feet, occasionally up to 5 feet wide inland, but pretty reliably about 4 feet. Again, same thing, just if you're using it near a pathway, maybe you'll give it a little bit more room. And then we have a couple of other ones that are awesome plants. They're kind of a little bit more of things that'll spread in the garden over time. And both of these I'm putting a little bit separately because they also, while they can survive on the very low amounts of water that the rest of these plants will survive on, they to stay looking good throughout the summer in our inland heat, really like either a bit of shade or some extra water. And so oftentimes if I use them in a front yard like this, I'll sometimes put them somewhere where it's easy, maybe like when I'm filling the bird bath, in between my main deep waterings in the summer after things are established. I can hit them with the hose just a little bit in between every once in a while, keep them looking a little bit fresher. But they're both great habitat plants. They look awesome, and they are worth that extra little bit of water in my opinion. And if you want to let them go on the drier side, they'll just go a little bit more dormant in the summer, and that's fine as well. And those plants are yarrow. Yarrow is a creeping spreading plant which will fill in any open spaces slowly over time. But again, for planting purposes, I consider it that in a year or so each individual plant will be about 1.5 feet wide. If I'm going to be planting them to kind of grow into a mass, I'll do them about 1.5 feet apart. And then hummingbird sage. And kind of same thing. I'll consider it about a 2 foot wide plant, and it will spread a little bit more over time. This one, if it's in full blasting sun, it will look great in the spring. By the kind of late summer, early fall, it'll be doing what some California native plants do and be a little bit dormant, less so if you give it that supplemental water, but then as soon as things cool off in the fall, it'll start looking really nice again. Sometimes you even get a little bit of a second bloom in the fall as well, and it smells absolutely amazing. So to me, even though there is a little bit of a down season, it is absolutely worth having in the palette and considering in your garden. And so that's basically what we're going to be working with for the smaller plants in here. We might not use all of them, but we have our shrubs and we have our smaller plants, and we are going to bring back in our circle template. And so what I generally kind of do is I'll normally kind of work from the larger plants down to the smaller plants and smaller details. And there can be plenty of reasons to be exceptions for that, but lacking any other better place to start, that's kind of what I will do. And I write down all of my sizes, so we also kind of have them ready to go. And I also think about kind of my priorities. Now I'm thinking about my priorities in terms of habitat, which ones I've, based on my research, are great habitat plants or provide for things that I want to, or have something specific about them that I know I want to include. I'm also thinking about blooms throughout the year, same thing based on my research, reading up on the plants in the palette. I'm thinking about the smell of some of these plants that smell absolutely amazing. So in the ones we talked about, the Allen Chickering sage is going to really be the one that brings that smell of California, as well as the hummingbird sage. The sages are often the smelly plants in our gardens, sages, sagebrushes as well, and a few other things. And then also, starting to think about beauty. So like we talked about earlier, some of that color contrast, that texture contrast. Now, again, bringing up either pictures of your plants or maybe even printing some of them out, leaving them in front of you, starting to get ideas about what will look good next to what else. And so I know for me, what I will want to make sure I have one of in a really nice place, and because it's going to grow into kind of be a pretty dramatic specimen, and I'm only going to put one in this garden, is going to be a sunset manzanita. And I'm thinking about that dark red bark of the sunset manzanita. I'm also thinking about the fact that it's evergreen, so I'm probably going to want it kind of near the western redbud, maybe in front, and to leave it, some space not too close. So over time, if it wants to get larger, it can also kind of grow in and do its own thing. And I'm not going to have to be hacking it back. And also I'm thinking about manzanita because it tends to bloom when there's not as much other stuff blooming. And so that I know it's going to get a little bit larger over time, but just for planning purposes, I'm going to consider it a 5-foot shrub. I'm going to give it a little bit more space off the coffee berries as well. Give it some space off the redbud. So just as a draft, maybe we'll put it in here. And that'll be a nice backdrop also with a lot of the views out of the house. Oh, sorry, we're doing initials. So we'll do SM. Then remember we put it in our key. SM, Sunset, Manzanita. And part of why it's also something I'm thinking about first is because it's going to be taller than all of the other shrubs that we have over time, which means it can be towards the back and we'll still be able to get a nice view of it. Now, one of my other priorities is Allen Chickering sage for the smell, for the habitat, and that's another one of the taller of this middle layer. And remember, I said it can get quite wide. And so again, I'm thinking I probably only have room for one of them. It's going to kind of be a specimen, and it'll kind of be something great for the backdrop as well. We're going to give it 6 feet. And so maybe kind of working it in right here. Be all right. And that's getting pretty close to our bird bath. So our bird bath might even need to shift a little bit. And this is where I said things are going to, change and evolve. And so I know I want a bird bath. I'm just going to put it in lightly here. I still want to have it be able to be viewed from both areas, but I want to have a little space around it. And what else do we have? We have our deer grass, which is probably going to be filling in through here. We have our Santa Cruz Island buckwheat that stays a little bit lower, potentially our desert mallow or bush sunflower or a Palmer's mallow. And let's see, we also have, thinking about color, we have our sunset manzanita, we have our, which is going to have a darker leaf. We have our Allen Chickering sage, we'll call it AC. Allen Chickering sage that has a lighter leaf. And so if we are going to do our Palmer's mallow, we probably don't want to do it right next to our Allen Chickering sage. There is a little bit of a difference in the look, but the contrast tends to be nicer contrasted with darker shrubs. And one of the things about the Palmer's mallow is that it does look amazing. It has very fuzzy leaves, and they look amazing if they can get caught with the backlight either in the morning or the afternoon. And so in our gap between these trees, in the summer, the sun is going to be kind of coming down over here a little bit. And if we put it in here somewhere, maybe that's something that'll work nicely for a Palmer's mallow. So let's get our 5-foot circle template. Maybe that'll fill the space. I don't want to get too right up to the path because I want some room for some small plants right there. Or if it happens to get a little bit bigger, I don't want things to get overrun. Maybe we'll fit it right in here-ish. And we'll do PM. This can be for Palmer's mallow. And now we have room for a few other things. I know I'm going to want to be working some deer grass in here, so maybe this is the time to start working in some deer grass, and then the Palmer's mallow will be like an accent in the deer grass. So let's think about that. And remember, it's going to take a while till this western redbud grows in, and if eventually over time there's not room for some of these grasses, that could be all right. But let's give it a shot. So here's my 4-foot. And I know I want to leave a little bit of extra room, but things are gonna settle out and push more. I'll probably do another trace layer to refine the exact positions of things. But let's see. We'll take a look at how this will work out. See, DG would equal deer grass. Okay. And if we want a kind of naturalistic little smattering, we can come to the edge a little bit in some areas as well, so we don't have to have perennials all the way along. And we'll work with little gaps in between. We'll fill with other stuff. Let's just kind of roughly feel this out. Remember, unless I want like a solid hedge of the deer grass, I'm going to leave some little bit of space in between for their flowers. Don't quite have enough space here. This is pretty much still going to be a pretty sunny area outside of the shade area. So maybe to kind of pull things through. Let's get getting a little close to the base of the toyon. We don't want to block our pathway. So this is also a good time as we're thinking about this. Remember, this is just the travel line of the pathway. So let's think about wanting our 3-foot wide pathway. And so to get that from the travel line, so 1 inch will be 4 feet, so 3/4 of an inch is going to be 3 feet. So we'll do our 3/4 of an inch, lining up halfway at 3/8 of an inch here, and we'll mark a number of spots along this path of travel. Just kind of what that would look like. Then we can kind of connect everything. We'll make sure that we have space. I'm already seeing that we'll need to make some adjustments because remember that extra foot of the flowers of the deer grass would already start interfering in our path. So we'll take a look. Maybe the path will move. Maybe the deer grass will move. So if our path stays how it is, this will be roughly what we need to accomplish with it. You can see something was off here a little bit, got a little bit awkward. So it's more connecting the dots, not really following the path. And then you can refine it. Connecting into our little smaller area that we're going to leave to access, get in here and do some maintenance. And just to clean things up, let's get rid of this center line. And we'll clean that up a little bit as we go. So definitely we'll make a few changes. If I was a little bit more organized in my thoughts, maybe I would have drawn that in first, but no big deal because we're kind of just feeling out the space. We have tracing paper, we have erasers. We're not trying to get everything perfect the first time as we go. So now we're looking back more at our deer grass. Another thing too, as I think about it, trying to have a little bit of a dynamic shape is, as we layer plants from the main view, which is going to be looking this way, we don't want to necessarily line things up that much. It kind of forms a little bit more natural of a look if things are a little bit more staggered. So have maybe something here. You can see that gives us a little bit more space for our deer grass. We'll have maybe another one. Get too close to the toyon. This is a group. Maybe we'll do another one here. So we'll definitely be able to see our sunset manzanita as it starts growing in. Behind it. And then here, this would be a great spot for our showy penstemon that I mentioned. So let's label so we don't. Showy penstemon, it's going to have the tall flowering spikes that come up behind everything else. Put that on the list. And probably have room to get deer grass in here still. And remember, this seasonal shade line, this is not absolute. I think things will still kind of work nicely here. actually kind of pull the eye through, and if I don't put another deer grass here, is there anything that I would rather put in? Maybe here the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat would actually maybe be a nice choice if it'll fit. It's going to get a little close to the toyon. I'll probably put a deer grass here. And then as we get a little bit farther from the toyon, because the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat actually can take some partial shade over time. And so an area like this is going to be full sun at the beginning, but as the toyon grows in, it'll get a bit of shade. So we'll do SCB for Santa Cruz buckwheat. And then, so we have the deer grass here. And this is forming a little bit too much of a line for my taste. That grouping is nice, but maybe we'll actually pull this deer grass forward a little bit. And in here, we'll put another showy penstemon. See, maybe we can get 3 in for some nice repetition. We talked about repetition earlier. If we can maybe get one on the other side of the path. And there's our 4-foot. So maybe here. And so this works nicely, I think, is starting to build our planting design. Our bird bath is continuing to need to shift a little bit because we don't want it to be right in the deer grass. But maybe here, maybe right at the edge of the path, and maybe our path will actually, so we can get a few plants in there, maybe our path is going to a little bit more dramatic of a curve than we were originally planning on, which is just fine. And then also, to me, it's okay if the path, here, if the deer grass does grow a little bit the edge of our pathway area. Remember, that's part of why we're leaving our larger path. And it's not going to be every day. If it was the major path to the door or something like that, then it'd be very important to keep it clear. But here, it's not every day that we're going to be getting back in here to do our maintenance. So it gives us a little bit more room, and maybe the path even narrows a little bit as it gets into this back area. I'm thinking probably this pathway, even though I'm drawing lines for the edge, is just going to be mulch for this front yard. It's going to be a very naturalistic front yard. It'll probably just be the wood chip mulch, and then basically just defined by maybe a few cobblestones, maybe some branches, and then just mostly being defined by where plants are not. So remembering to relabel our bird baths. And so this gives it at least a foot in all directions from the plants. And deer grasses will actually like a little bit of that extra water from the bird bath. It doesn't need a lot of extra water, but you're not going to overwater deer grass. You could overwater Allen Chickering sage, so we do want to make sure we have a good couple of feet from the edge. When we dump it, we can just kind of make sure we're not splashing too much water in that direction. So here we have our deer grass, and let's see if we can get one more showy penstemon in here somewhere. Maybe it'll be here. But that's kind of in the main view, and like I mentioned, it kind of does have a little bit of a down season where it's not doing that much. Maybe we want to get it more off to the side here where it can kind of do its thing and then come into view. So maybe, even though this will be some partial shade during part of the year, maybe we'll try to see if it'll work well here. I'm not growing showy penstemon in part shade, but a lot of the other penstemons do work quite well in part shade, so I think that'd be worth a try, just because that would give some nice repetition when they're all rising up in the garden in the spring. So we have our Santa Cruz buckwheat, and we are maybe getting, we've filled this mid-ground area, we are maybe getting to be filled up with our shrubs. We didn't do our bush sunflower, and that's just fine. Maybe there's room for that in the backyard. So let's work through some of our other plants and then check in with where we are at. So we are going to look at the design for this little planter area as well. And I mentioned that we are going to be using the creeping barberry because it works really well for that kind of north-facing foundation planting. And this is slightly more than 3 foot wide bed, so maybe we'll just keep it simple here. We'll just fill it in all the way down, and it creeps a little bit, so our last one can be a little bit flexible where it is, so it'll fill in over time. If you have a French drain, it's okay if the plants end up going over part of the top of the French drain. You know, all the water action is still going to be working underneath, and in fact that looks a little bit nicer. So roughly, that would be what we could have, just a simple foundation planting. A little bit more orderly, more natural on that side. Not room here, but maybe we'll do something else there. So remember to put that on the key. Creeping barberry. And maybe we'll end up repeating it along here. Maybe not, but I think for the sake of simplicity, maybe we'll just go ahead and do that all along the whole base. Nice kind of orderly element to kind of contrast some of the wildness of the rest of the design. And again, if you want a more wild look, you can definitely go with it. There's lots of different treatments of how we worked with near the base of the house in the different templates. So this would just be one possible approach. And now, how are we going to deal with this seasonally shaded area? And then we have kind of our pops of color and our perennials along the edge and our pathway to deal with. But we're getting there. We already, you can kind of feel this starting to come together. Always remember to refer back to your goals every once in a while. This is keeping all of those goals in context. And so our other accents that we are going to want to work in here. Let's first work on the seasonal shade area because that's going to be a little more limited. That's going to need plants that are good with full sun or part shade. And we have some great ones on this list. So in this area, we are going to concentrate on yarrow, hummingbird sage, and then maybe a little bit of lilac verbena towards the sunnier areas, but can take some part shade, and margarita penstemon towards the sunnier areas, but can take some part shade. Can fit a little red buckwheat in there. That kind of likes more on the sunnier side, but just a little bit works as well. So a lot of these do work. We'll probably, within a space, we'll probably keep red buckwheat to the sunnier areas. But in the shade, yarrow, hummingbird sage are going to work great. A little bit of lilac verbena and penstemon. And remember, lilac verbena, 4 feet, that needs a little bit more space. And so let's find some nice, we really want to make sure that we have that. It's an awesome butterfly nectar plant, so we want to make sure we have some room for that. It'll look really nice. There's some nice contrast between the darker leaf color of that and the Santa Cruz buckwheat, and then they flower at different times of the year. Well, the Santa Cruz buckwheat flowers a lot of the year, but that will be flowering later in the season after the lilac verbena has stopped. So we're also going to give the lilac verbena a little bit of extra room. So the French drain, which we have through here, will help accommodate that. If it needs to get a little bit bigger, it can kind of grow over the edge there. So let's plan on our lilac verbena. And the Delamina lilac verbena is really kind of the nicest one and the one that's most commonly available. But we'll just call this LV for now. LV, let's keep it simple, lilac verbena. And so we have one lilac verbena, which is lovely, but we are wanting to work with some repetition as well for that visual aspect of it. It's also nice for the habitat functions to have repetitions of some of the smaller plants in the garden, whether that's near each other or with the larger ones kind of spotted around. And so we'll look for another spot for this verbena. And even though it's not a formal landscape, with one here kind of maybe 5-6 feet off the edge of the path, maybe there'll be room for another one kind of in here. Dips a little bit into what I'm anticipating to be the shade zone, but kind of significantly sunny. So something like that probably will work out pretty well. A little bit of room off the path, maybe room for some smaller plants. And it's getting a little bit close to the showy penstemon. Maybe there'll be something else I want to do there instead, because the flower colors are pretty similar, but I don't worry too much about flower colors. With the right diversity, things tend to work themselves out, and even within purple, there's different depth of it, so we'll just leave that there for now, and then consider what else we have to work with, because I don't think there's room for a whole other one anywhere in here. And so we've worked with our lilac verbena. And so what we have now is definitely probably room for hummingbird sage. We're going to pull out some yarrow, and we're going to work with margarita penstemon and red buckwheat. You will notice if you look at the bird and butterfly songbird garden design examples that there are lots of examples of yarrow being planted near bird baths. It just looks beautiful aesthetically with the low kind of ground cover of the yarrow, the bird bath coming up out of it, kind of filling in the open space, and then the yarrow will thrive on that extra little tip of water when the bird bath is being cleaned out every day. And so I think that's going to be a really nice way to fill in all around here, with maybe filling in at the edge, maybe to kind of keep this gesture of the hummingbird sage going. Maybe we'll do one hummingbird sage down at the end, and then maybe we'll fill in with yarrow, they're 1.5 foot all around the base of the bird bath. And again, remember, we'll put that in just a single and if you want to, if it looks more naturalistic, you can fill in a couple more back in between here. Maybe I'll do one more, and it's just going to kind of spread and fill in anyway, so it'll end up looking pretty naturalistic because the yarrow will spread some. Oh, my pencil broke. Let's see. So Y is yarrow. And then we'll probably bring that across as well to the other side of the path, kind of keeping things a bit natural looking. And I'm sure this will start to grow into the path, and that'll be just fine as well, since it's just going to be a mulched path. Kind of walking into a nice yarrowy space. And it's same thing, if we're doing a little bit of supplemental watering, hitting our hummingbird sages and our yarrows, this can all be done kind of at the same time. Do we want this a little bit more sparse? Might have this be, we'll just fill it in. And if you want to add in other things, perennials or whatever, you can, but I think in this iteration, it's kind of considering the design. You can kind of think about what it'll be like to be walking through this whole patch of yarrow, which will be quite lovely. Yarrow also does really well in these areas that get very wet, are somewhat shaded, don't have much space to do anything else. So we'll consider a little patch here, and a little patch filling in over here. Don't need to be in a straight line. Look a little bit more natural, kind of at the edge of the dry stream bed area. And hummingbird sage does pretty well in those situations as well. So we'll kind of mix through that yarrow hummingbird sage mix. That could appear in a couple of places. So here we have a little bit more room to work. So maybe we'll do a group of 3 hummingbird sage. And since we're looking out the windows, this layering looks very nice as well. We have the window will look over the creeping Oregon grape, the creeping barberry, and look out towards over the dry stream bed at the hummingbird sage. And the yarrow mix. Oops, sorry, this is supposed to be an H. And then what else do we have to work in here? We'll infill more of this, but let's get some of our other plant diversity going as well. So we have red buckwheat and margarita bop penstemon, and both of those can be used well if you look through the examples. Sometimes in the examples and the templates we use them in groups of 3, which creates a little bit bigger of a visual impact. Sometimes, occasionally we use them in groups of 2, sometimes we just have them as individual kind of accents. And so in a landscape like this, when they're kind of going to be maybe holding their own in a small patch with some of these larger shrubs, I like using them occasionally in groups of 3. And so we will see what we can do. And the showy penstemon will work pretty nice along the path, quite nicely along the path. And let's see, I'm trying to decide if we want 1 or 3 here. And again, all of this can nudge in a final. And I think I'm just going to go with, let's see, the toyon, and pretty quickly will be about 5 feet wide. And so that would already be significantly going over that. So I think what we'll do is we'll just do this for M, for margarita bop penstemon. M equals margarita bop penstemon. And these, remember, it doesn't need to be totally covered with plants. And that's something also to mention is we generally recommend landscapes with a pretty high plant density. Helps control the weeds, it kind of maximizes the beauty of the plants, it maximizes the habitat benefits. But if that just seems too much and you need to leave a little bit more space in between plants, that's just fine as well. If you look through the templates, some areas and some of the templates are more dense, some of the designs are pretty dense based on the plants, some are less. And so if you want to go with less density, you always can. But in areas like this too, in a naturalistic garden, it's nice to mix in, and good for habitat as well, to mix in some boulders, kind of rocks in certain areas, some branches, and so little gaps where there's not quite room for another plant. That also can be a great place for either some rocks or a small log, which you will see, which is mentioned in the previous videos, and you will see showing up in some of the templates. And so maybe that will work nicely. And then if things just seem a little too open, especially in the California native garden, the first year around some of the trees where you're leaving some space, sprinkle a few California poppy seeds, let a few annual wildflowers come up, and that's a easy temporary way to fill some space. And so we'll do a penstemon here. We will do, I really love margarita bop penstemon. It's just bloomed for so long. I really love kind of lining pathway areas with them. Normally not a row all the way down. If you do a row all the way down with most of the native perennials, just the truth is that a couple of them will just up and die and the whole row will look kind of strange. And that's often the case even with other Mediterranean plants from other Mediterranean climates like lavenders and things like that. So we can kind of dot them here and there. So we'll do M. And then also, I think in the corner, I really love them in kind of like big front and center areas, like where walkways, driveways, and they can take that reflected heat. They can take some part shade, but they can take a lot of that inland heat as well. So we'll do a nice grouping of 3, a nice impact right here. And then 1, 2, and so maybe we'll fit a third one in. Maybe all the way back here, pull the eye back here. Give it a little bit more space. It can interact some with the flowers from the deer grass, but kind of along the way. Maybe there'll be one other one in there eventually. We'll see what happens. And we also have our red buckwheat, which is awesome. Awesome plant. Can be a little bit into the seasonal shade zone, but it's going to be probably more successful in the sunny area, and we can do that in groups of 3. It'll look great with the verbena. So maybe we'll mix that in over here. We'll do R for red buckwheat. I can do a few, it's 2 foot, so I can do a little area of, a few small pile of rocks or something in between there to fill there. In between this lilac verbena and the red buckwheat, we have a little gap on this side. Maybe we just add something like a log in here. Great little spot for lizards to hang out, add habitat some, and even if there is a gap, the plants eventually might grow in and cover that up. But just ways of dealing with that. And so slowly we find ourselves with a little bit less and less open space, and continuing to program what will go on in what area. So we have our red buckwheat through here. And so it seems like it's just kind of begging for us to balance that with some red buckwheat over here. Remember, it can get larger than 2 feet, so we'll give it just a little bit more space over here because it's right at the beginning of the path. We'll do maybe another clump there. And then we have just another little gap through here, but this might be somewhere where we can make the French drain seem a little bit more naturalistic by bringing in some cobblestone kind of up through here, and maybe in what we anticipate to be that gap as well. And we're looking pretty good. So with that, maybe we will actually go ahead and add in another group, the Margarita penstemon. And then we'll bring back in, maybe reflecting back the hummingbird sage for another group of 3. That again might need another little splash of extra water from the hose every once in a while. And then we have some open space through here. And we don't necessarily need to completely close off everything with plants. And in fact, we do want to be able to make sure we can get into this area for maintenance, wash the windows, things like that. We have our path here. Yarrow is pretty easy to step over, but maybe we would actually keep this even a little bit more open on purpose. Now that I'm thinking it through, I tend to do very extremely plant-dense gardens for myself, but sometimes for the average homeowner who just wants a nice garden, it's nice to leave a little bit more path space. And this is really like a secondary pathway, tertiary pathway maybe even. So this could just be really a gap, and the yarrow will overgrow it some, but we can kind of plan for a gap through here. The deer grass, and what would we want to put in this back area as well? Maybe for here, we would add a little bit more of the creeping barberry, creeping Oregon grape, kind of instead of just a straight line, we can kind of curve this off some. And so maybe we'll put just one of these back in here, and that will leave a little bit more naturalistic of an edge, and that just is a little way to sneak on through as well, just thinking about little deer trail type footpaths. And then on this northern exposure, because this is going to be shady a lot of the year, the yarrow isn't going to require quite as much supplemental water, so maybe we will just continue this yarrowy area, and we'll add just a few more here. And we are almost done. Through here, because we are looking out of this window though, this is going to be our main building view. Through here, our great view to the bird bath. We do want to make sure that this is pretty well planted, although we will occasionally have to get through here to clean, etc., etc. So maybe what we would do is, after you can kind of hop over here, maybe we'd put in, even just a few squares are 1 foot, just a simple, whether it's flagstone, broken concrete, pavers from the hardware store. Maybe it'd be nice to have just a simple paver pathway. And then yarrow can actually grow in, fill in among pavers. So we just kind of scoot things here and there. And that'll be a nice way to get around there with, we want this very nice filled in look here. So a little bit of a, not really even a leap, but just a big step to get it started. And then we'd have that pathway through there. And so now we're just kind of down to the very end of what we would be filling in here. Maybe here, we're in the seasonal shade zone. So maybe we have our hummingbird sage here. Maybe we will continue this yarrow out and also leave room for some natural features. So we have, some logs through here. We can do a little bit more wood. We can leave room for plenty of cobble along the edge of the dry stream bed. We want it to be natural. We're not going to want it to be the straight line like it is here. So this is a good chance to plan for some of that. Cobblestone through here, anchoring the edge of the landscape. And then by the time we're done with that, we're just extending our yarrow in here just a little bit. And in here, we can do one more. Let's go with, to keep it simple, rock, and then just one more hummingbird sage, rather than introducing a whole other element. Sometimes less is more. Then we just have a few other areas left. And remember, we're finding what to do in each one, but you don't need 172 different kinds of plants. And all of these templates have been designed where, for the most part, you can fill all of the niches that you would have in the average landscape. Now, if you want to pull in another plant, you can absolutely do it. So you can go on the Inland Valley Garden Planner and tell it, to give you what are some other perennials that are going to be good in either part shade or full sun, because we need to meet both of those. You can check, make sure that they work for both and that are California native, and you can pull in something else that will mix in nicely with that. Or you can just repeat something from the palette. And for most average gardeners who aren't really necessarily wanting a super diverse landscape and just want something that works along a theme, it's sometimes better to just think, what plant should I repeat? And this is a 1,200 square foot landscape. What I find is most of the time we have no more than somewhere between 10 and 20 different plants. So let's count how many we have so far. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So kind of right there in the middle. So if you want to be a plant enthusiast, if you identify as a gardener, sure, bring in more diversity. If you're someone who doesn't want to learn too many different plants but wants a great butterfly and songbird garden, then just figure out what plants to repeat where. And that will also kind of be a shortcut to having the look of the garden hold together, not having too much one of this and one of that. Make it work for whatever you want, whatever is going to be best for you. Grab a sharp pencil and let's figure out the edge spaces. So in full sun with our smaller plants, we're really going to rely on our red buckwheat, our margarita penstemon. Out here it's too far away from the hose to want to do more hummingbird sage. And then also what we can do is, if we wanted to leave some areas to mix in a few annual wildflowers, some California poppies, maybe some Clarkias if we want it to get taller, we can leave some areas open for that. We can mix in some stone and stuff along the edge as well. And then in addition to that, we can always look for other plants to bring in. An easy way for the kind of hobbyist gardener to have some other kind of really reliable stuff along the edge as well. In full blasting sun, some of our California native perennials are not always super long-lived, so I wouldn't say you don't want to do like 100 of them just lining the whole thing. After 3 years, some of them might not be there anymore. In kind of more in the middle of the landscape, they tend to be longer lived, but really with this harsh inland reflected heat. But you can mix in a few small succulents, which hummingbirds still love most of the succulent flowers when they do come into bloom. So for here, this corner, let's go with a little grouping of red buckwheat. Our 2-foot little circle template. Keep it simple. And then as we go through here, maybe along here, we'll just edge this with some different rock, cobblestone, keep the water meter area open, make it easy for the utility guide to get there. Here, if we want to fill this space when the red bud is small, and maybe it'll be able to keep going for a while. Maybe we'll mix in a deer grass. It might be a little too much. Maybe we'll just look for something else. I'm going to bring in one other plant. One other plant that works really well with all of this. It's in some of our other native templates, and it works really great in these edgy, sunny areas, but can also take some part shade, is California fuchsia. So this would be one that if you're looking for another plant, you're not quite finding what you want from the template. You go back to the garden planner, you look at what else you can bring in, and we'll do F for California fuchsia. And it slowly spreads. There are some cultivars that don't really spread nearly as much. It slowly spreads, but just for planting purposes, I'll give it about 3 feet in the garden. And that is a really lovely plant because it has a lovely flower. It's kind of on the wild side. However, it blooms in the late summer through much of the fall when a lot of the other plants are kind of done blooming in the garden. So it extends that season. Absolutely loved by hummingbirds. So it's one that could have been in this palette. The only reason I didn't include it is because it's in a number of the other palettes. Very compatible, and it will take that transition from full sun to part shade underneath the red bud very well. It does get cut back all the way to the ground in the winter, but then it starts growing back pretty quickly. And so we can start dotting that in for some color along some of the edge. And I already know that once we add that back in, here we have Palmer's mallow. It'll be lovely in front of that. And we have a little bit more room. And so that, I normally give it 3 feet, and it'll spread. It's easy to pull out if it gets to where you don't want it. Let's do a whole little block of it here. You can plant it closer if you want as well. We'll do a whole little block of fuchsia, which will be lovely in the fall. You can take that reflected heat. Here we can go with another little spot of the Margarita Bop penstemon, maybe right on this corner Yeah, nice pop of color on your way in. Here I'll just do, maybe we will do a block of them, just for a nice greeting of the year. And then here, why don't we leave this block open for some wildflowers. There's a whole wildflowers details page on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Easiest way to get to it is you can just type wildflowers into the search and you'll find the page with suggestions on very easiest native wildflowers to start with. So we can leave a few blocks, little pops of color, which will then turn into, when they dry out, birdseed along the edge here. As the toyon grows in, this will go from full blasting sun to significant shade, and so that's also a nice area where you can leave open for some pops of wildflower. And then as it gets shadier, you can kind of change what's there. So we'll do wildflowers here, just right underneath here, which that'll get grown over pretty quickly, and right near the base of the toyon. Maybe we'll do some small boulders or some rocks kind of dotted here and there, remember, and you can kind of fill that in. Every single rock definitely does not need to go onto the plan. Kind of fill that in on the site as you go in the real world. Maybe another log here. And then we'll also definitely do another little repetition of some red buckwheat. And with this full blasting sun and reflected heat as the toyon grows in, the red buckwheat will appreciate a little bit of shelter as well. And again, if you want it to be more naturalistic, you can just dot them through and not do them in groups. But here we're having it be a little bit more garden-like. And then right here, we can do one last spot of a place to sprinkle a few wildflower seeds. And there we go. That's a planting plan. It would be a very lovely garden. The pathway would just be wood chip mulch, and will grow in, and let's review our goals. Will it meet all of our goals? Beauty? Absolutely. Habitat, we have lots of great habitat plants and also all of the habitat structure. We have some logs and we have some boulders. We have some areas for annual wildflowers. It'll be great. There'll be so many birds and butterflies here. It'll totally transform the space. It is low water. We're working with all low water plants. We get that sense of privacy and shelter. We're going to have blooms throughout the year. We integrated extra that California fuchsia for the fall blooms, and we have the manzanita with even a little bit of winter bloom, and lots of great stuff. Early spring with the creeping barberry or creeping Oregon grape. We have the smell from the sage, and we have worked very carefully at the beginning with the heights to keep that mountain view. So this is a landscape that will meet all of those goals. Now from here, you have a number of options. What I would do in the real world, if this was my garden, is I would consider this just one of my options, and I would bring it outside. I would think about it. I would then refine this. So probably I would bring it outside, maybe on a piece of cardboard, kind of taped down so I can look at it and kind of walk myself through, picture it the best I can, maybe make some notes and revisions. Then we'll do another piece of tracing paper over it and then try to revise it even more. Now from there, I also might just put that off to the side. Maybe I will do some other plant research and maybe do one completely different version of it if that sounds good to you. Some people will be like, I've thought about this as much as I want to. I'm going to stick with this. That is great as well. And so where we will go from here is we will just kind of imagine that we have decided that this is going to be our final plan. It's a little bit sloppy, not the easiest to read right now. And so what we will do is we will come back, we'll do another layer over it, we'll cleanly draw the circles, and then we'll also maybe do a little bit of sketching with some colored pencils and color to help bring out some contrast and make it easier to read.
And so we've arrived here, which is a completed and functional garden design. but it's not that easy to look at. It's kind of messy, and messy doesn't matter as long as the document works for you. I don't mind messy personally, because for me it's all about the function to get a beautiful garden in the real world, and the drawing is just something to help that process along. However, even for me, this is still going to be a little bit kind of chaotic looking and hard to read if I'm standing out in the yard working on my plant layout. So once you've arrived at your kind of final iteration, most likely, at least until you start laying out plants in the field, you've arrived at your final take on the design as it's going to look on paper, then you might want to clean it up a bit. And so that's what we are going to look at right now. And that's simply a matter of preserving this kind of completed plan and laying on another sheet of tracing paper, and then just doing a final trace where you are going to be just kind of cleaning things up. And so that can be all freehand if you want. In this example, brought in the circle template again, just to kind of more quickly make some clean lines and outlines. And this is also a great time to make any last tweaks. If there's anything that you've been kind of hesitant about, or you're thinking, I'm not sure quite how that's going to work out, or maybe another plant you discover that you want to work in, design's a continual process, so go ahead and do that. And so, for example, through here, I was thinking about the plants on either side of this little path coming through and wanting to change and tweak things a little bit. And so you can notice on the south side, lower side of the path, I wanted to mix in another Santa Cruz Island buckwheat, just as an example of the plant used there. And so as I was doing that final trace, I wanted to simplify this area just a little bit. I love the plant red buckwheat, but they were starting to feel like there was maybe a little too many of them in the design for what I was wanting to go with. And so I just made that last little tweak and then continued along the way. If you want to, you can then kind of color code things to make it a little bit easier to look at, a little bit easier to tell the blocks and the repetitions of the plants apart. And that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a work of art. If you're very artistic, it can be. But in this case, this is just a cheap set of colored pencils and just kind of color coding so that the different repetitions of color make it a little bit easier to do the final plant counts and lay things out in the field. What I have, for example, all of my red buckwheats that I bought at the nursery in a pile, I could easily see where those need to go out to. And so working with that and continuing on and on, bringing back in my abbreviations for each of the plants as well, and continuing on using a fine tipped permanent marker for the text, which will read better than pencil on the final version of the plan. And then you can do little outlines and accents as you want. And again, in this case, this is not at all about being a work of art. It's just about having a functional plan that's a little bit easier to look at and maybe gives me a little bit better of an idea of how things are going to come together. And then filling in the mulch just to help make everything else pop a little bit more, and then bringing through all of my plant labels. And then from there, take a picture of it. You can have it on your phone. You can make prints of it, do whatever you want. You can put it in a scanner if you want, but honestly, these days, most of the time, I just kind of try to square it up and take a picture of it on my phone. And that ends up being just as good of a reproduction, if not better than like most scanners that would be done through a photocopy machine or something like that. So there you have it. Here's a plan that ended up being quite similar to the plan I implemented in my front yard garden that you've seen pictures of throughout this video series. A little bit simpler, a little bit more of a defined path, and a little bit more of an open space to make it kind of more of a friendly design for like an average home gardener, and a little bit less dense and wild and crazy. But again, it's all about what is going to work out and be the best for you. There is no such thing as a best garden design or a best aesthetic style of garden. It's about what kind of space you are going to feel comfortable in and you are going to love. So now, from this plan, where do you go from here? Well, we have lots of other resources for that as well. So I would highly encourage you to check out our YouTube playlist, cbwcd.org/YouTube, where we have a whole other recorded workshop all about installation and establishment for California native and Waterwise gardens. So going from a plan, whether it's a concept in your head or a actual drawn out plan like this, through all of the stages to get that installed and going off to a great start. If you have turf or a lawn left, even if it's been pretty abandoned and pretty brown at this point in time, I highly encourage you to look at our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop as well, because lawns can be surprisingly resilient once, even just for the little bit of establishment watering, that once a week deep soak to get your Waterwise plants established. That would happen after they go in. That's enough for a lot of lawn types to actually come back in a patchy way, not to be a beautiful green lawn, but enough to cause issues. So you really want to make sure that you do your due diligence on the lawn removal part as well, and go from there to set yourself up for success. So check out all of those other resources. If you are on the Waterwise Garden Planner website, you can go directly to the resources section and either look at some of those top additional videos on that page or get the link to our YouTube playlist there as well. But just as a quick preview from here with this plan, this is a good time to stop and remember what a drawn out plan is for. You don't need to install your landscape exactly as seen on this plan for it to be successful. And in fact, the best landscapes keep it a little bit loose and really think of this as a planning document to help you get the right number of plants and generally have a good idea of where those are going to go in the landscape. But when it's times to actually lay things out, you might want to make some tweaks there, because when you're putting plants out, you're going to notice new things. And so this is a little bit kind of my process is with that plan, then I will spend some time just thinking about the plan, visualizing it on the site, and really making sure that I don't want to make any additional tweaks. It's a lot easier to make those changes ahead of time than to do it 3 months after you put those plants in the ground. And then I encourage you, especially for major social areas in the landscape, pathway locations, large trees, is to do some basic layout of the garden ahead of your planting day. And so you can use whatever you have at hand. These are tools that I often use. A bag of flour is essential for my process of laying out pathways and patios and things like that. Sometimes I use wood stakes, and then I often will use little sprinkler flags from the irrigation supply store to lay out key plants, and those can be labeled with a Sharpie as well, and figuring out locations. And because I do a lot of landscaping work, I have a bucket where I reuse them for years and years. If you're just doing a single project, you might not want to buy all these little things, but you can use whatever you have, rocks or anything that you could label, just anything that you have around. So here's just a couple of examples of a project where we're laying out the pathway with the flower, and to lay out these concentric circles from the center, we just hit a stake in and then had some strapping that's actually normally used to tie trees to stakes, and kind of just pulled it out to a certain measurement, held that tight, and made a loop around that stake while dribbling the flower. And then the same thing for the path from there, to take a look at it, make sure it feels wide enough, make sure everything looks great before we're actually putting the plants in the ground. It could be even simpler than that. This is when I was laying out what was going to be the deepest part of the dry stream bed, going through my backyard before we started construction, thinking about planning for it. And I just used the corner of a square shovel and started kind of just dragging lines into the soil so I can take a step back, look at it, use the shovel to kind of smother things and erase the lines and redraw the lines, and kind of go from there. With trees, I'm a big fan of having someone stand where the tree is going to go on the day of planting and put their arms up like they're the branches and think about, what that's going to look like over time. Sometimes that's just a little bit harder to visualize. And then when someone's standing there, someone else can look at that person from multiple different angles and get a better idea of how you can actually envision that tree growing in to be a major feature in the landscape in a more clear way than you can when you're looking at it on a sheet of paper on a two-dimensional plan. And so my partner Kira, who is very involved in our garden as well and is also a professional horticulturist, was looking at me and took this picture. And then we switched places and we made sure that we both thought, this is going to be a great place to put this desert willow, a small tree that would stay lower than the power line and not cause issues. And then we basically made sure that we both liked the exact final position before putting it in the ground. So we only need to plant that tree once. And then just a quick recollection, we'll cover this in many, many workshops, but when you actually lay out your planting, and you might notice things, tweak things around, move them, but you have your final planting, it's in the ground. You're going to have this moment of, oh my gosh, I should have planted bigger trees. I should have got way more plants. It doesn't look like anything. And if you are doing your job right, that chances are that will be the case day one. If I could find plants all in 1 gallon pot sizes, I will do that. So here is our Western redbud tree right here. Does not look like much at all. We have toyon, or other large shrub, small tree is in here somewhere. Our hedge is over here. It's not going to look like much, but resist the temptation to go back and buy larger plants or put way more plants in. So this is March when we planted, a little bit later than my ideal planting time of late fall, early winter, but that was the schedule we were working with. And so from there, you can see about 2 months in, here's that little redbud tree and starting to get a little bit of color. But at 13 months, here's that same area. And there's still a lot of growing to do, but it's definitely a garden and it's well on its way. And in fact, I'm confident that this redbud tree is growing faster than it would have, which is often the case, than if I planted it from like a large 15-gallon plant or something like that, because a lot of species of plants will grow quite a bit slower in many cases if you plant them larger. And so with that, have a fun and interesting time working on your own landscape design. Don't be intimidated, just jump into it. You might go through 3, 4, 5 different iterations. Maybe it'll take you a week, maybe it'll take you a month, maybe you'll spend a whole 6 months planning on it and going through multiple different versions before you settle on something that you really love. Whatever your process is, that's fine. If you aren't going to draw it out all the scale on graph paper and you're going to do it more intuitively and kind of lay things out and do it a little bit at a time, that's great too. It's really all about what process is going to work best for you and will be the most fun for you, whether you're doing all of the work yourself, whether you're working with a contractor, whether you're doing some sort of mix. Make this process your own and make it a fun, enjoyable process. You're probably not going to get everything perfectly right the first time, and that's just fine. It should be a fun, enjoyable, and educational experience. So don't be intimidated. Get into it, and we have lots of other resources to help you along the way. So just to end this video, here are our top links. The Waterwise Garden Planner. We teach lots and lots of free workshops on all sorts of different topics at our headquarters in Montclair and occasionally online, so you can see all of those upcoming descriptions and register for workshops at cbwcd.org/Waterwise workshops. Again, here's the link directly to go to our YouTube page for past workshop recordings. Visit us at our Waterwise demonstration garden in Montclair, over 3 acres of California native and other Waterwise plantings on display with plant labels and interpretive signs, so you can really ground all of these thoughts also in visiting a free space open 6 days a week in reality and see some of these things for yourself in person, and sign up for our newsletter. Just 1 email a month keeps you in the loop of everything that we have going on and any new resources that we are launching. If you somehow ended up on this video without checking out the other videos in this playlist, you can click on the link below to take you back to the full playlist, where this is the final step in a whole process we take you through about learning about and planning for your garden design. So with that, have fun with your project. It might feel like there is a lot to process, so take your time with it. Enjoy the process, and please let us know in the comments if you found this video and this series to be helpful, and if there's anything else that you think we should consider developing to help you along the way. We hope to see you here in person someday at the Waterwise Community Center.